strange, dark, and mysterious. If you're into stories that make your skin crawl and keep you up at night, then buckle up because this one's a doozy. Delivered in the style you love, true crime, wrapped in eerie details with a twist that'll leave you questioning everything. This is the story of the Forbidden House Mystery. It's a tale from a quiet town in rural Ohio where something unspeakable happened in a house that locals swore was cursed. So let's dive in, but fair warning, you might want to leave the lights on for this one. Before we begin, tell me where are you listening from and what time is it there? She said, if I go missing, it was my husband, then she disappeared. The warning so many women know by heart does not always arrive as a tidy sentence. Sometimes it shows up as a string of worries shared with a sister, a coworker, a friend who asks if everything is all right and waits through a long, careful silence before the answer comes. In the middle of that silence, on the morning of Wednesday, March 15, 2023, in Hinds County, Mississippi, a 36-year-old mother named Ebony Owens did not arrive for her shift. Phones rang, messages stacked up, a supervisor tried again. The stillness around her absence felt wrong, and it felt wrong fast. By late afternoon, relatives had contacted law enforcement. Deputies drove the familiar roads just west of Jackson, over low hills and long stretches of pasture, through clusters of pines and the flat, muddy shoulders that turned dark after rain. Night pressed in. Somewhere out there, beneath the watercolored sky of early spring, a white Acura would be found with fire in its belly and smoke unspooling into the trees. The license plate had been pried away and flung into the woods as if a rectangle of metal could erase the truth of a person's life. The car sat near Old Highway 80 and Jones Road, an intersection used by school buses and farm trucks, not a place for anyone to burn a thing that once carried a family to church and back. Search teams fanned out along culverts and fence lines, into the ragged edges of ditches, and the places where blackberry vines knot up and catch on denim. The weather teased warmth during the day and cooled at night, a soft, shifting air that carried the smell of ash. 10 days is a long time to breathe that smell. 10 days is an eternity for children who want to know whether their mother will tuck them in again and whether the house will feel the same. 10 days after the first call, on Saturday, March 25, 2023, the Big Black River gave up an answer. Not the answer anyone prayed for, but an answer all the same. Investigators worked the case the way river people learn to work a current, reading what moves beneath the surface as carefully as what shows on top. They pulled threads that led from the burned Acura back to the couple's home, where the quiet rooms had become a ledger. Rifles and ammunition, a blanket and clothing darkened with blood. The kinds of items that cannot hold their breath when a warrant opens a door. A bridge over the Big Black carried traffic and, according to forensic testimony later heard in court, a trace that linked back to the same home and the same marriage now peered at under the harsh light of a homicide investigation. Neighbors in Edwards and Jackson and the unincorporated routes between them would tell you marriage is complicated. The courthouse will tell you something else when a body has been recovered and a car has been set ablaze to hide it. The charges arrived in that plain legal cadence that never softens the edges: first-degree murder and third-degree arson. A judge's docket wrote the dates in tidy type. A jailer learned a name. To the family, the process felt like counting backward from a cliff. Through 2 long years that forced birthdays and holidays to be observed with a chair no one could bear to fill, the case made its slow way toward trial. Evidence was logged, motions were argued. In May of 2023, at an arraignment marked by the awkward dance of reading and understanding, the man accused entered his plea. Summer thickened into autumn. Across 2 more winters and another spring, the Big Black kept its course under weathered trusses and past stands of willow, while a courtroom prepared to gather a dozen citizens to weigh a death. In early September of 2025, in a Hinds County courtroom where the air conditioner hummed and the fluorescent lights made everyone look just a little more tired, 12 jurors took their seats. Reporters angled for the clearest view. On Thursday, a state forensics analyst described DNA consistent with ebony on a bridge where, the jury was told, decisions were made in the shadow of night. An investigator with the sheriff's office fielded cross-examination as defense counsel tried to chip at chain of custody and inference as if a life might come undone by picking the right thread. The jurors kept their faces still, pens poised, eyes sliding from witness to screen to counsel table. Then came the testimony that settled into the room with the gravity of a falling anvil. The defendant took the stand. In a voice that wavered between insistence and explanation, he said he had found another man in his own house, in his own bed, with his wife. Anger flared. He claimed fear. He said he fired a gun, that he watched the aftermath of a bullet and made decisions no one can spin into mercy. The state countered that there was no evidence of another man at all, that this was not panic but planning, not a sudden storm but a course charted by a person determined to erase what he had done. The jurors heard both stories, each word weighted with consequence. They also heard about the car, its white paint blistered and sooted by flame near Old Highway 80 and Jones Road, and about the license plate tossed into the trees like a gambler discarding a losing hand. They heard about the river, about March water cold enough to steal the air from your lungs, about how currents take what they can and hold it until they cannot. They heard about the home, where the quiet would not cooperate, where metal and fabric and the microscopic language of blood told a version of Wednesday night that could not be talked away. On Monday, September 8, 2025, the jury delivered its verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of third-degree arson. The clerk read the words aloud. A dozen shoulders tightened and then released. The court thanked the jurors for their service, though the word service feels small next to the task of deciding how a life ended and who bears the weight of that end. Before sentence, the judge spoke. People who have spent years in courtrooms learn to choose their moments, and this was one of them. Very seldom does a case, the judge said in substance, trouble this particular bench. Yet this one did. The word that kept coming to mind was selfish. The courtroom seemed to lean forward as the syllables landed, because selfish, said out loud by a judge wearing the plain black of authority, is another way of saying you placed your want above another person's life and the lives of 4 children who deserved a mother's voice in the next room and a lamp on in the hallway at night. Life in prison for the murder. 3 more years for the arson. A sentence made of numbers to follow years made of waiting. In the benches, family members pressed hands together and let out the kind of breath a person holds without meaning to. Outside, the late summer heat slid over concrete and idling news fans. Inside, a clerk stamped papers, a deputy opened a side door, and the man once called husband and father followed where the law told him to go. If you stand on the Big Black River Bridge and look down, the water flickers and folds like silk pulled between invisible fingers. Swallows nest in the shadowed undersides of beams and use the river as a runway. Long after the patrol boats had cut their engines and the tape had come down, people still slowed as they crossed, eyes skimming the surface the way you look back at an old childhood home. Grief asks you to become a cartographer of places you never wanted to map. The curb where a car once smoked and popped, the ditch where a plate gleamed under leaves, the courtroom door that will always be heavier than it looks. The record will never bother itself with how Ebony baked on Sunday afternoons or whether she danced in the kitchen when a song she loved came on the radio, but those who knew her will. They will remember the way she called her children by their nicknames, the way she kept a calendar crowded with school pickups and dentist appointments, and the ordinary scaffolding of a life built for other people. They will remember that she showed up, right up until the morning she could not. They will also remember that before she vanished, she had worries, the kind you speak in low tones at a kitchen table or carry in the tightness across your shoulders when you walk from the parking lot to the front door. Maybe she did not say the exact sentence so many of us have heard. If I go missing, it was my husband. Maybe what she said lived in gestures and hesitations and the way she changed the subject. But the social math is cruelly familiar, and it keeps ending with a head count that shows who most often stands too close to the edge when violence is ready to push. The jurors did their arithmetic. The judge did hers. The river did what rivers do, and delivered something heavy to shore. In the days after sentencing, the headlines moved on, because they must. But in the places and times that matter, the story did not move at all. In the Owens family home, every little object still knows where Ebony last put it. A child reaches for a bowl and feels the soft impression of a mother's hand in the habit of where the bowls go. On a school morning, someone ties a shoe and hears, as if from the next room, a voice reminding them to double knot it. At night, someone switches off a light and stands for one full beat just to listen to the house breathing, the way a person does when they are trying to remember something that should be easy and is no longer easy at all. Everything that can be done has been done. Evidence collected, witnesses heard, a verdict returned, a sentence announced. The earth takes the departed back with a patience that is not human, and the law keeps what it seized with a permanence that island. If the warning that hovered over this family's life never carried those exact words, the end still carried the meaning. On Wednesday mornings and Saturday nights, on paydays and school programs, and the unremarkable afternoons that fill most calendars, there are people in every county of this country who hear that quieter version of the warning and choose not to look away. They drive a friend to file a report, they stand by during a call to a hotline, they sit in the hallway outside family court and hand over a bottle of water. They go with someone to collect a few clothes from a small apartment and hold the door while the last bag is carried out. If you are one of those people, keep going. If you need one of those people, say so. The help exists. It is not weak to reach for it. It is not unloving to insist upon safety. What happened between the first missed call on March 15, 2023, and the verdict on September 8, 2025 is now written into Mississippi's public record and into the much older record kept by river towns that understand both kindness and harm. The story is finished, at least in the eyes of the court. A husband is in prison. A car is scrap. A river keeps moving. A family learns, painfully and forever, how to live around a space that will not close. He kept 3 girls captive for 10 years, and no one noticed. The story begins on a cool spring afternoon in Cleveland, Ohio, at a modest 2-story house on Seymour Avenue, not far from the lake where gulls wheel and cry. The porch railings are chipped, the blinds forever tilted, the front door almost always shut. Neighbors pass with grocery bags and stroller wheels clicking over cracked concrete. Music sometimes drifts from inside. A radio tuned to oldies, a drum beat muffled by thick curtains. It is an ordinary street in an ordinary American city, the kind of place where people wave from porches and borrow ladders without signing anything. And yet, behind those tired blinds, 3 young women lived in captivity for a decade while the city moved around them, unaware or unwilling to believe. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from? And what time is it there? Their names are Amanda Berry, Michelle Knight, and Georgina Gina DeJesus. They were taken in the early 2000s over the span of a few springs and summers that should have carried them into first jobs and first apartments. Instead, their paths converged in a small set of rooms, a maze of improvised locks and chains, a radio that was loud when the captor wished, silent when he did not, and the constant rasp of fear. The man who took them, a former school bus driver named Ariel Castro, knew the neighborhood well. He knew which streets emptied at the end of the school day, which families hurried, which porches sagged. He knew how to look like a neighbor and not a menace, how to nod and keep walking. Michelle Knight disappeared first, in the late summer of 2002. She was small, tough, and older than the other girls would be when they vanished. She had been trying to reclaim parts of her life the world had made hard for her. On the day she was taken, she expected an ordinary errand near West 65th. The sky was a dull pewter, with a little wind moving wrappers along the curb. A familiar car slowed beside her, the driver leaning across the seat with the easy voice of someone she had seen around. He offered a ride, a few minutes, a quick stop, and then home. She hesitated. She wanted to believe in the shortcut life rarely offers. She got in. The click of the door was light. The meaning was heavy. When the car turned towards Seymour Avenue, she did not know she had crossed a border she would not step back across for many years. The second disappearance came the following spring, in 2003, when Amanda Berry finished a shift at a burger restaurant on Lorraine Avenue and started the walk that was supposed to end at her front door. It was a day with the kind of light that makes a city look honest. She called her sister on a payphone, a voice quick with plans for cake and a birthday that was coming the next day. Then the same familiar car, the same friendly wave. The man said he knew her sister, said he could take her home faster, said all the little things that stitch a stranger into a pattern of safety. She trusted the pattern just long enough. The car door shut. Music on the radio played a song everyone knew, upbeat and harmless, and the sidewalk slipped by. The third girl, Gina De Jesus, was 13 when she disappeared in the spring of 2004. She was walking home from school with a friend, secondhand chatter fluttering around them like sparrows. In a moment that still makes the air go thin when you think about it, Gina and her friend split at a corner that should have been nothing more than a corner. The car stopped again, the same driver, the same casual acquaintance language, the same promise of a short ride. She stepped into the illusion of ordinary kindness. The door shut. The city continued, unaware that another family would soon be taping flyers to telephone poles and asking questions that felt like prayers. Inside the house on Seymour Avenue, the world became small. Windows were covered, doors groaned with extra locks, hallways narrowed with stored junk and deliberate clutter, the better to slow a sudden flight. Rooms were repurposed into cells. Music from an upstairs radio sometimes blared through the floorboards when the captor wanted to drown out their voices or his own thoughts. At night, the furnace clicked and sighed, and sometimes a neighbor's dog barked, then fell quiet again. The smell of old carpet, fried food, motor oil, and dust saturated the air. The women learned to map time by the way sunlight found seams in the blinds, by the scent of winter's first radiator heat, by the creak of steps that meant he was coming. There were rules. Do this, not that. Speak only when spoken to. Step here, not there. Punishments were swift, the logic always shifting, so that safety could never settle. He starved them or fed them on a whim, bought them fast food, and then withheld the next meal for days, as if kindness had to be balanced by cruelty. He sometimes gave them gifts, little objects that carried poison under their ribbon, a new shirt, a cheap necklace, a used television, a coloring book, a winter hat. He forced them to watch the news when reports of their own disappearances flickered across the screen, then shut it off with a satisfied sigh when the story moved on to weather and sports. He called them by names he chose, wrote the rules, erased them, wrote them again. Families searched, flyers went up and came down in rain and snow and went up again. Candlelight vigils lit the fronts of stores and churches. Tips poured in, hot with hope, then cooled. Amanda's mother, whose determination could have bent steel, went on television, pleaded with anyone who might know anything to come forward. She died before her daughter came home. Gina's parents stood beside clergy and police, their voices steady even when their hands shook. Michelle's name did not make as many headlines. She had been pushed to the edges of the city's attention even before she vanished. But she was loved, and those who loved her kept asking. The seasons turned. Years became a dull loop. Police chased leads that turned to fog. Some neighbors noticed a boarded window and thought little of it. Others saw the man carrying heavy bags into the house at odd hours and shrugged because people carry strange burdens all the time. There were close calls. The front door stood open for a moment. The screen latched, but the spring weak. A neighbor stopped by to talk about a car, a drum kit, a broken taillight. Footsteps approached the porch and paused. Inside, a television was turned up to cover the sound of breathing. Once a child's toy was seen in the yard. Someone asked about it. The captor said a niece had visited. Smiles, a little wave, the porch conversation ended. The door closed, locks clicked. In the house, the women found a way to hold on to themselves. They whispered to one another when they could. They passed notes when they could not speak. They learned the rhythms of the captor's job and the gaps those rhythms might grant. They invented small rituals to remind their minds that time still existed and belonged to them too. On birthdays, they whispered the date to themselves and let a single memory bloom. A slice of cake, a tiny gift, a swing in a park, a hand squeeze. They taught and retaught each other the shape of courage. They promised to remember their true names. One spring, hope changed shape. Amanda, whose voice had remained steady in the worst storms, had a child in that house, a little girl with quick eyes and soft hair. The captor claimed paternity. The truth was a testament to survival. The women shielded the child with everything they had. The house became a school. They taught the girl letters with penciled notes, songs hummed softly, stories told in whispers. They showed her which boards creaked and which ones sang. They taught her the difference between ordinary and danger by the smallest signals, the sound of keys tossed on a table, the scrape of a chair. The girl grew up knowing that a window could be a wall, but that a wall could be imagined as a window. When the radio played a song that sounded like freedom, she swayed in place and watched the curtains lift a little in the summer heat. The seasons kept turning, the city grew and eroded and grew again. Houses were painted, then left to peel, the bus routes shifted. On Seymour Avenue, there were years when little changed. Then a sudden new porch column, then nothing. People move through a city like water through a net. They catch on some threads and not others. Ariel Castro kept slipping through. In early May of 2013, a series of slight decisions aligned. The captor left the front of the house less secure than usual. Perhaps he was arrogant, perhaps he was distracted. Perhaps the old screen door did not catch the way it used to. Inside, the air felt different, as if the house itself were about to exhale. Amanda reached for the door and felt it give more than it ever had. Her heart hammered a warning and an invitation. She looked at the child and knew that waiting was another kind of danger. She whispered, and the whisper felt like a vow. She pushed. The door resisted, then shifted. She pushed again with a strength that had been hoarded for years and kept ready for one exact moment. The wood cracked. The chain complained. She screamed then, a sound that climbed the stairs and went out into the street, a sound that used her voice and also every voice that had been kept small. A neighbor heard. His first instinct was disbelief, then confusion, then action. He came forward, tried to kick, tried to lift, tried to pull. The door gave more. The city might have heard the hinge groan. The opening became a gap big enough for a face, then a shoulder, then a body. Amanda slipped out, a child in her arms, a decade traveling behind her like a storm cloud that had finally found a seam in the sky. She ran to a phone and called for help, and when the operator asked for a name, she said her own, as if signing back into existence. The street tilted toward the possibility of rescue. Sirens soon braided through the neighborhood air. Police moved through the house and found Gina and Michelle. The officers called their names, and the names echoed, then landed. There were tears and shouting and relief so intense it bordered on pain. The three survivors emerged into the kind of daylight that stuns the eyes. Neighbors cried, reporters began to gather. Strangers found themselves pressing hands over mouths or against chests as if to hold a heart in place. Family members ran and then slowed and then reached. The city felt for a moment as if it were breathing together, in and out, slow and grateful. The arrest was swift. The man who had walked that street for years with a bag of groceries and a flat expression was taken downtown in handcuffs. The house was sealed. The blinds that had been tilted closed for so long would soon be lifted, and the rooms would give up their secrets. In the days that followed, crowds pressed against police tape and stared at a front door that had finally swung wide. Reporters read lists of items recovered inside. The city grew angrier and sadder by the hour. Some neighbors wondered aloud how they had missed it. Others said they had always thought the house felt wrong, but did not know what to do with the feeling. People brought flowers to a block that had never asked for flowers. The legal process moved with a speed that surprised even those used to courts and calendars. In late summer of 2013, after indictments stacked high with counts that measured only the smallest part of the harm, Ariel Castro stood in a courtroom whose air felt both heavy and precise. He pleaded guilty to avoid a trial. The judge pronounced a sentence so long it needed extra language to hold it, life without parole, plus enough additional years to swallow any fantasy of return. The gavel sounded like a door being closed the right way at last. In that same season, the house on Seymour Avenue was demolished. On the day the heavy machines rolled up, the crowd gathered again. Some came to witness justice of a physical kind, the erasure of a building that had lived as a wound. Others came because they needed to see the structure end in order to believe the story had changed shape. The excavator's claw took the first bite, wood splintered, glass broke into small clean sounds, and the sun struck new angles where walls had stood. A neighbor signaled the start by handing Amanda a lever, and when she engaged the mechanism that began the teardown, she was applauded. Not because demolition is beautiful, but because it can be an act of mercy. Dust rose, then settled. In place of a prison, there was open air. In the months that followed, the survivors did what survivors do. They sought care, then quiet, then the exact mix of speaking and silence each of them needed. They wrote or waited to write. They went to appointments that measured health in numbers and in softer measures like sleep. They re-entered rooms where people said welcome and meant it. They showed extraordinary grace in the face of relentless attention and, inevitably, uneven compassion from a world that both aches for stories like this and sometimes consumes them too quickly. Michelle published a memoir and later another, her words sharp and generous, tracing the way a life can be rebuilt from the inside out. Gina and Amanda told their story together and then stewarded a foundation to help other families who wake in the night with the same terror they once endured. The little girl grew up in a different house where doors are doors. She learned that a street can hold both danger and rescue, and that the sound of sirens can mean help is coming. The city learned more slowly. People argued about what anyone should have noticed, whether a neighbor should have pushed harder against intuition, whether the small signs were small enough to excuse a collective failure. The arguments mattered. They also could not undo what had happened. What could be done was to make new habits, to listen longer, to ask twice, to check on the quiet house with the uneven blinds, to take a feeling seriously even when it arrives without proof. As for the man who caused the harm, he entered a state prison and lasted only a short time before he died by his own hand. The story of that ending is not the story that matters most. The legal record closed. The moral record had been written already by a decade of suffering and resilience. The city did not hold a vigil for him. The women did not need to speak his name. Years later, the block on Seymour Avenue looks like many American blocks rebounding from hard times. There is a patch of grass where the house stood, and sometimes wind moves through it in a way that sounds almost like breath. Children pass on scooters, dogs tug at leashes. The mail carrier stops and jokes with a resident leaning on a railing that has been repainted. Life makes its small repairs. The neighbors know the story, newcomers learn it. The memory does not own the street, but it is part of its map. If you walk Cleveland in the late afternoon, when the sun climbs down the sides of buildings and the air smells faintly of iron and lake water, you might pass by and pause, not in morbid curiosity, but in respect. You might think of a city that failed and then tried to make amends, of families that refused to surrender memory, of 3 young women who endured something no one should endure, and who, when a seam finally opened, ran through it and let each other out. You might hear traffic on Lorraine, someone singing 2 houses down, a screen door slamming, a crow scolding from a wire. Ordinary sounds, blessedly ordinary. The title of this account asks a question that still stings. How could he keep 3 girls captive for 10 years and no one noticed? Part of the answer is that people did notice fragments and could not assemble them. Part is that poverty and neglect can hide both predator and prey in the same shabbiness. Part is that we prefer a tidy world. Another part is that the captor understood how to wear the mask of normal. The final part is this: noticing is not the same as knowing, and knowing is not the same as acting. The lesson Cleveland learned the hard way is that we must build a culture where all 3 happen in sequence and with care. There is no ribbon tied neatly at the end of a story like this. There is only a closed door torn from its hinges and replaced by open sky, a city that wrote a promise to its citizens in dust and sunlight, survivors who continue making futures one brave choice at a time, and a community that learned to listen with its eyes as well as its ears. The question remains, but so does the answer you can hear in the steady cadence of their names. Amanda Berry, Michelle Knight, Georgina Gina DeJesus. They were here all along. They are here now. The rest of us must be worthy of that truth, and the street must stay bright enough and the doors must stay open enough that when someone whispers for help again, the whole neighborhood hears and moves. She faked her own kidnapping and fooled everyone. On a warm Thursday night in mid-July, the kind of southern evening where the air hangs sweet and heavy above the pines, a 25-year-old nursing student named Carlethia Carly Nicole Russell left work in Birmingham and drove south toward Hoover. Traffic thinned along the long, curving lanes of Interstate 459. It was after 9, the sky dimming from bruised purple to black, and the low hum of tires on asphalt felt like a lullaby meant for people who had finally clocked out. At 9:40 something, Carly dialed 911. Her voice was quick, urgent, as she told the dispatcher she had seen something that should not be there. A toddler, small and alone, wandering near the guardrail on the shoulder of the interstate. She kept talking while she put her hazard lights on. She told the dispatcher she was stopping. She told a family member on another line what she had seen. She described a tiny figure beside the sweeping rush of headlights, the danger, the need to act. Then the call went quiet. The line stayed open just long enough to suggest movement, footsteps, a sudden intake of breath, the strange chorus of engines whipping past, and then a muffled silence that made everything feel wrong. Minutes later, officers found her car near the tree line, just off the southbound lanes, hazard lights still flashing. On the road, they found a cell phone, a purse with an Apple Watch inside, a wig. No one could find Carly. The next hours stretched like wire. Night settled into early morning, and the interstate turned into a search corridor. People in reflective vests paced the grass with flashlights, their beams sliding over weeds and broken bottles. Patrol cars idled on the shoulder with their light bars rotating in steady, hypnotic sweeps. State agencies were notified. The community gathered online and in parking lots. When the sun rose on Friday, it lit a broad swath of suburbia that had suddenly learned the stomach-dropping word missing. By Friday afternoon, Hoover's police chief, Nick Durzis, stood behind a podium and tried to thread the needle between caution and urgency. Reported abduction. Reported toddler. The department was in contact with federal partners. The public was asked for tips. There was no evidence of a child on the shoulder, but there was the call, the car, the items left behind, the young woman gone. The story caught fire. A young woman on her way home. A child in danger. A sudden absence. It had the rhythm of nightmare. Strangers wrote messages of hope. Local businesses offered rewards. Volunteers stapled flyers to telephone poles and tacked them on corkboards in coffee shops. The edges of the paper curled in the humidity, while people pointed at the smiling photo and spoke in lowered voices. Elsewhere, detectives began tugging at threads. They laid out a minute-by-minute timeline from the second she left her job to the second her voice faded from the 911 tape. They pulled camera footage. They emptied the trunk, they got warrants, they sat in front of screens and looked at a history of searches that made their shoulders go tight, Amber Alerts, how old to qualify for one. The Birmingham bus station. One-way bus tickets to Nashville. The plot of the film Taken. What happens in a kidnapping. How to steal without being caught. The queries were not proof on their own, but they were the kind of clues that changed the temperature in an interview room. Saturday evening, after roughly 2 days that felt like 2 years to the people who loved her, Carly came home. She walked through the front door, and the house erupted into relief. She said she had been abducted. She said she had been forced into a car by a man and a woman, then kept out of sight. She said she had escaped. She was taken for medical evaluation. The community exhaled in gratitude and confusion. In the quiet that follows a miracle, investigators watched the pieces fail to lock together. No child was reported missing in that corridor. Traffic cameras did not show a tiny figure. No motorists had dialed in a sighting. The shoulder where she said she stopped had no marks of a struggle, no signs anyone had scrambled through the brush, and the only items recovered were the ones she left. The more she talked, the more the story frayed under the steady pressure of questions. Days later, the same chief returned to the microphones with a statement from her attorney. There was no kidnapping on Thursday, the 13th of July, in the year 2023. She had not seen a toddler on the side of the interstate. What began with a phone call and a missing car had become a hoax that had pulled in loved ones, strangers, city workers, and federal agents. The apology named the people she had frightened and the resources she had consumed. It was clear, it was painful, it was public. The search's aftermath was quieter than the frenzy that fueled it. Officers logged overtime, volunteers folded tables, and drove home. The interstate kept hurrying people past the exit where the hazard lights had once blinked. Over the next weeks and months, court dates replaced search parties. The first hearings were held in the municipal building, under the bright, humming lights that make every bench look the same and every hallway feel colder than it should. Reporters whispered about possible sentences. Lawmakers talked about penalties for false reports. The faces at the defense table changed expression by degrees you only notice if you have spent time on those benches. The most gripping thing, in the end, was not the twist of deception, but the ordinariness of the consequences. A young woman stood before a judge in the Bessemer division of the circuit court. She admitted she had lied. The judge spoke in a voice without theatrics, laying out the penalty with the steadiness people expect from the bench: supervised probation for a year, community service, continued mental health counseling, restitution that read like a ledger of everyone who stood under floodlights and knocked on doors in the thick night air and hoped for the best. The amount was exact down to the cents because the hours were exact, and the fuel and the paperwork and the overtime lines printed on pay stubs. The order would follow her until it was paid. You could watch the long tail of the story in the small details. On a weekday, months after the plea, a clerk rolled a cart of files into a courtroom that smelled faintly of paper and disinfectant. The docket moved, her name was called, a lawyer updated the court on payments, another status date was set. Outside, on the courthouse steps, people in suits moved from shadow to sun and back again, while a local camera crew adjusted a tripod and tried to catch 15 seconds of footage that captured the whole thing. Across town, someone stood at a service counter and signed a sheet before heading out to pick up trash along the edge of a park, a bright vest over a t-shirt, earbuds tucked in, a bag in one hand, a mechanical claw in the other. A supervisor initialed the box when the shift ended. If you go back to the night where everything began, you can still feel the feeling that made so many strangers act. The imagined danger of a child on the shoulder of a busy interstate is a powerful, visceral thing. People share that instinct to swerve, to shield, to intervene. That same impulse carries fundraisers and volunteer lines and candlelight vigils, all those tender, stubborn rituals a community falls into when someone it barely knows suddenly needs everyone. The human mind also seeks patterns, explanations, a story that makes awful sense. It was tempting to paint Carly as an easy villain or as a symbol, a headline instead of a person. But there was no supervillain lurking beyond the guardrail, and there was no neat parable here, only choices and their ripples. She did something reckless and untrue that cost people time and hope. She said she was sorry. The court system answered in a way that kept the doors of a jail closed and the doors of a counseling office open. The city kept the receipt. For families who posted her photo and paced their kitchens with phones in their hands, there was a bruise of betrayal that faded slowly. For the dispatchers and patrol officers and detectives, there was another case file with a different kind of ending. For the rest of us, it was a reminder that even a lie can summon the very best parts of a community, which is precisely why it feels so heavy after the truth arrives. The highway still runs past Hoover, smooth and bright under the floodlights. On some nights, the sky is so clean and clear you can see the blue glow of dashboard screens from a bridge as cars slide beneath you. On other nights, rain hammers the lanes until the shoulder looks like a narrow river. People make their calls. They say what they have seen or think they have seen, and the voice on the other end keeps them calm while help heads that way. Somewhere, a dispatcher hangs up, writes a time in the margin, and listens for the next ring. There is no mystery left to solve in this story, and there is nothing to wait for. What began with the kind of plea that makes people pull over and look around ended with a record that says plainly what happened. A phone call, a lie, 2 days of fear, an apology, probation, community service, counseling, restitution that gets chipped away month by month, like a slow debt to a town that showed up when called. The lesson is not that people should stop looking out for one another. The lesson is that truth matters most when the stakes are highest, and that a community's faith is a living thing that deserves care. The summer night has long since dissolved into other seasons. The headline has moved down the page, the interstate hums, and if you stand on the shoulder where the hazard lights flashed and listen, you will hear only wind and tire noise and the rush of air across guardrails. No voices, no panic, no miracle return at the front door. Just the ordinary life of a place that answered a call, learned the truth, and went back to work. He terrorized a town at night and was never caught. They called it the Spring of Fear. Not at first, At first, it was only a rumor that drifted through the piney woods, across the low bridges, and over the state line that splits Texarkana into two jurisdictions and one shared heartbeat. By the time the leaves thickened and the cicadas began to sing, the rumor had hardened into a name that people refused to say after dark: the Phantom. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? The year was 1946. America had just stepped out of one war and into the uneasy brightness of peace. Returning soldiers wore their hair short and their optimism longer. Saturday dances filled gymnasiums. The radio spun out swing tunes and baseball scores. In Texarkana, a town pinned between Texas and Arkansas, night meant cruising the two-lane roads that curved into the countryside, a few miles from neon signs and soda fountains. Couples parked beneath live oaks. Crickets stitched the silence shut. On a Friday night in late February, the air was cool and damp. A draft of fog clung to the ditches off Richmond Road. After midnight had tipped into the small hours of Saturday, a young man named Jimmy Hollis and his companion, Mary Jean LeRae, pulled to the shoulder at a quiet spot. They talked. They listened to the faraway swish of tires on Highway 67. They did not know that some footsteps had already found them. A shape emerged from the dark. He wore a burlap-like sack pulled low, two eye holes cut roughly. He held a pistol. He ordered Jimmy out of the car, voice flat, almost effectless, as if reciting. He demanded that Jimmy remove his trousers, then struck him down with the barrel until bone gave way and blood pooled black on the road. He turned the gun toward Mary Jean and told her to run. She stumbled barefoot into the brush, afraid to look back. Branches lashing her calves, the smell of iron and earth filling her lungs. He caught her. He threatened. He dragged her to the road again. He toyed with terror like a cat with a trapped bird. And then, just as suddenly, he vanished into the dark. Jimmy survived, so did Mary Jean. The hospital lights were too bright for the stories they told, and the sheriff's men scribbled notes while the doctors stitched wounds and pressed ice to swelling. A masked man. A voice that did not rise or fall. Demands that made no sense, no fingerprints, no tire tracks that could be trusted on a road that carried half the county. Officers fanned out under the washed-out dawn, boots wet with dew. They found scuffs, a smear, a thread, nothing that stayed. The newspapers in Texarkana ran the story on Saturday evening. A masked assailant. A brutal beating. The words felt like a stray storm cloud that would blow away by Monday. But the cloud did not move. It grew. 4 weeks later, on a Sunday in late March, a motorist noticed a Ford coupe pulled off the gravel near a lover's lane west of town. The car doors hung open. Inside, blood soaked the seat. Nearby lay the bodies of Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore. They had been out dancing. They had driven into the night that every couple knew. Now the radio still hummed, thin and tinny, while the wind passed over them, taking heat and leaving silence. Bowie County Sheriff William Presley drew in officers from both sides of the line. Some names still echo when people tell the story, their vowels rounded by time and dust. Deputy Tillman Johnson worked the roadside and the ditches. State troopers set up checkpoints. The Arkansas police and the Texas men traded jurisdiction the way men trade a heavy box, careful and strained. Reporters arrived with notebooks and the crisp, decisive words of big city papers. They wrote of a masked man, and the phrase took on weight, like a verdict delivered before the trial. The town reacted first with stubbornness. Theaters stayed open. Teenagers promised their parents they would be home early, then tested the edge of curfew like they always had. But the air changed. The laughter on front porches faded sooner. People walked each other to their cars and watched the rearview mirror longer than they watched the road. Hardware stores sold out of locks. Gun shops emptied by noon. Dogs slept nearer to the front door, as if they too knew that night had begun to carry a different kind of sound. In mid-April, the Phantom returned. On a Saturday that bled into Sunday, a boy named Paul Martin never made it home, and a girl named Betty Jo Booker did not return from a dance where she played her saxophone with a high school band that had no idea they were hearing her last notes. Searchers combed the ground as the gray morning pressed its thumb on the horizon. They found Paul first by a barbed wire fence, his body arranged by hands that felt nothing. A little farther off, among the scrub, they found Betty Jo. The instrument she loved turned up later. hidden in weeds, as if it had to be silenced too. By then, the name had settled like dust in the lungs. The Phantom. People said it without wanting to. Churches filled, windows shut early, theaters turned off their lights. The sheriff's office lines rang all night, the phones rattling with reports of footsteps, of a car idling just beyond a hedge, of a figure passing a widow's glass. Every shadow was a man. Every creak of a board was a boot. Fear sharpened the edges of ordinary life until even kindness looked suspicious. Texas Ranger Captain Manuel T. Gonzalez drove into town wearing a suit that fit like a decision already made. His reputation ran ahead of him, a rumor with a signature. He spoke softly. He listened more than he talked. He walked the roads where the couples had parked and marked off distances with long strides, head tilted. He rode with deputies along dirt lanes, the dust rising behind their tires in slow, patient curtains. He bought coffee at small diners and asked the waitresses what they had heard. Everyone had heard something. Almost nothing could be used. Officers tried roadblocks and nighttime patrols. Citizens formed watch groups and roamed with shotguns cradled like infants. Newspapers begged readers to keep calm. Editorials stitched together common sense and prayer. The town strained so hard to be brave that you could hear it, a faint hum like a high wire under a man's careful feet. In early May, when the heat began to lift from the asphalt even after sundown, the Phantom shifted patterns. A house on a country road, a couple, Virgil and Katie Starks, living their ordinary evening, a radio playing softly, a porch light burning, a shot cracked the window, Virgil fell where he Saturday. Katie ran for the phone, blood pooling in a widening halo. Another shot tore the quiet again and again. She crawled, staggering, leaving red on white tile, red on wood. She made the front door. She made the porch. Across the yard, neighbors saw her and ran, and in those 15 minutes that felt like a lifetime, the night split open like a curtain and showed everyone what they were afraid to name aloud. This was not a cruel prankster, not a jealous boy, not a vagrant with liquor-soured breath and a story that would make sense when the bottle ran dry. This was someone who could vanish between house and ditch, between scream and siren, between the trembling finger and the telephone dial. The Rangers dug deeper. They examined spent shells and the way the glass fell inside rather than out. They mapped circles around each scene and measured how far a man could walk without being seen by a neighbor or a dog. They listened to gossip about a car thief who drifted through town with a woman who alternately loved him and feared him. They considered a loner who kept strange hours and wore his hat low. They wrote names on a board and erased them. The town waited, the way a body waits for a fever to break. One man drew particular attention. His name was Yule Swinney, a petty criminal with a taste for stolen cars and quick getaways. Officers examined him, interviewed him, studied his wife's statements, which rose like flames, then collapsed like ash. She said he had confessed to the killings, then she recanted. She said she was frightened, then she said she had lied. In those days, a spouse's testimony could be more difficult to use than a smudge on a window. The law had its limits, the evidence had its holes. The case against him tightened, then loosened. He went to prison, but not for murder. People watched the newspaper, waiting for bold letters announcing an end to the fear. The bold letters never came. Summer arrived like a shallow breath that would not deepen. The dances resumed, slowly, cautiously, as if the band was playing with one eye on the exits. Theaters lit their marquees a little earlier. Restaurants set extra chairs near their doors, where the breeze might bring in the sound of an approaching siren. Parents insisted on chaperones. Teenagers pretended not to mind, then minded in private. The town learned how to carry dread the way you carry a heavy satchel you cannot set down. If you live there, you remember small things most clearly. The way a screen door clicked at midnight. The way the neighbor's porch swing creaked a little and then stopped. The smell of gun oil at the hardware store. The sudden sound of a radio announcer lowering his voice as if the story he was telling might hear him and change course. The sheriff's car idling on a side street while moths worried the headlamps. A group of men on a church lawn talking too loudly about weather and crops, then falling quiet together as if someone had touched a nerve they all shared. The investigation teemed with motion and yet could not move the needle of certainty. Texas men, Arkansas men, rangers with notebooks, deputies with photographs that they had studied so often the corners frayed, a reward posted, a cascade of tips. Some callers were cranks spinning tales for attention, some were frightened to the point of invention, turning every odd neighbor into a suspect, every battered car into a getaway vehicle. Now and then, a tip sounded like the brass ring finally within reach. Now and then, the officers felt their hearts jump. Then tests came back, alibis hardened, distances proved impossible. A detail failed to fit, the brass ring was smoke. The presses in Texarkana worked late through spring and early summer. Reporters learned the back roads by heart. Editors argued with typesetters over adjectives that felt either too small or too sensational. Every sentence had to balance on the thin beam between panic and denial. Families clipped the articles and tucked them into drawers that smelled of cedar. People who moved away took those clippings with them. Decades later, when they opened the boxes, the paper crumbled in their hands like leaves. Fear is rarely a single note. It is a chord, layered and shifting. In Texarkana, it sounded like the uneasy harmony of routine and vigilance. A mother tying back her hair and counting the seconds until her daughter returned from a movie. A father checking the door for the third time, then the fourth. A high school boy practicing his excuses and his bravery in the same breath. A deputy driving the same loop again and again and again, making a pattern that might be predictable enough to catch the man who slipped through patterns like a fish through a net. By late summer, the phantom's violence ceased. If he was one man, he either left or chose to stop. If he was a story that had temporarily walked on legs, those legs gave out. The town did not relax so much as slowly exhale, one careful inch at a time. The Rangers drifted back to Austin, the sheriff's office filed the photographs, the watch groups put their shotguns back in closets where dust, at last, had a chance to settle. Time passed. A year, then 5. The war faded into memory, replaced by new wars fought far away and noisily reported at dinner tables. The teenagers who had clenched their teeth through fear became parents who learned to say, "Be careful," without letting their voice tremble. The roads where couples once parked grew busier. Light encroached on the edges of fields that had felt limitless in the dark. The town stitched itself the way skin knits after a deep cut. A scar formed. You could deny it in daylight. At night, in the hush between one song on the radio and the next, you could still feel the pull. Investigators kept the case alive as best they could. Years later, some officers looked back and insisted that the man had been among those first suspects. They said his name like a password to a club you did not want to join. Others argued that the case had never been one man at all. Copycats. A run of crimes linked by fear more firmly than by evidence. They reviewed the files, shaking their heads at the limits of mid-century forensics. If only, they said. If only fibers. If only DNA. If only the ability to match bullets with a kind of mechanical certainty that would render doubt into a footnote. But history does not take edits. It keeps its first draft, smudges and all. The Texarkana files remained as they were, ink on paper, photographs with white borders, statements signed by hands that have since stilled, the girl with the saxophone, the boy by the fence, the couple in the car, the woman on the porch, blood streaking the boards, will burning hotter than fear. The names matter. The lives matter more than the man who came in the dark. And yet it is the dark we return to when the town's story gets told. There are details that still hold the mind. The burlap sack with rough eye holes, the voice without a tremor or any trace of laughter. The way the crimes for a time kept to weekends, as if the killer worked a weekday job like anyone else, punched in and out, and then slipped beyond the clock when the moon rose and the roads thinned. The precision with which he approached, the quickness with which he was gone. The absurd tenderness of a saxophone tucked into weeds as if it needed to be hidden from the Sunday. If you walk those roads today, the trees are taller, the ditches are deeper, the world is louder. But if you stop and let the cars pass, if you let the last one's taillights disappear, you can hear what they heard. A faraway whistle, wind glancing off wire, the chirr of insects, the hush that comes right before something breaks it. The town is different now, but night is night. It presses, close and weightless, like a hand that does not mean to harm and yet reminds you of hands that have. Some stories refuse endings. This one has a different kind. It has a stopping place, and the stopping place is not satisfaction. It is acceptance. Sheriff Presley's men did not find the killer. Captain Gonzalez and his rangers did not pull a single right thread and unravel the whole. The suspects named in confident whispers did not become perpetrators in the record. The phantom of Texarkana receded the way some storms recede, not because they resolve, but because the sky decides it has had enough. The families bore the weight, as families do. They marked birthdays that did not come. They kept rooms as they were, then finally changed them, slowly, one drawer at a time. They sat at kitchen tables with sunlight on their hands and chose to speak or chose to be quiet. Their grief did not seek the loudness of headlines. It lived in the stoop of shoulders and the softness of eyes and the way they greeted each other at church with a grip that lingered a second longer than manners required. And the town carried on. It learned that fear can be outrun only by living. Street lamps multiplied. Patrols changed routes. Citizens got better at calling in what they saw without letting imagination whip every shadow into a threat. Younger people moved in and learned the story as local history, not lived memory. Older people sighed and nodded. The river ran, the ball games were played, the neon signs winked on and off each evening, and had no opinion about the past. If there is a lesson, it is not a comfortable one. There are acts and actors that slip past the perimeter we build of locks and laws and vigilance. Some of them are caught, some are not. A community is not defined only by its worst nights. It is also defined by the mornings that follow, when doors open and people step onto porches and the smell of coffee floats out into air that feels, if not safe, then at least shared. Texarkana's spring of fear ended without a headline. The papers moved on, the rangers took on other cases. The sheriff's blotter returned to the ordinary rhythm of thefts and disputes and the occasional bar fight that ended with apologies poured over gravel. The victims did not return. That is the fact from which all the other facts must hang. And the man who took them did not stand in a courtroom and hear the verdict. That is the space into which the mind wanders when the house is quiet and the past leans close. Yet the town is not a wound. It is a place where people are born, fall in love, grow old. A place where a woman once crawled bleeding across a porch and found the strength to pull herself into the yard where neighbors were already running. A place where a girl played saxophone beneath gymnasium lights and made a roomful of people lift their eyes and grin. A place where a boy walked toward a car and was not alone when they finally found him, because from that moment on, no one told his story in the singular. Kidnapped at 11, found 18 years later in her kidnapper's backyard. On a cool morning in early June of 1991, in the pine-threaded quiet of South Lake Tahoe, an 11-year-old girl named J.C. Lee Dugard walked toward the corner where the yellow school bus usually chuffed to a stop. The light was thin and silver, the kind that makes even the road look like it has been polished overnight by wind. She wore a pink jacket against the mountain air, hugged her books to her chest, and listened to the hush of the neighborhood waking up. Somewhere a screen door clicked. A dog barked once. A car turned the corner and slowed. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from? And what time is it there? It was the kind of car that looked ordinary until it did not. A gray sedan idling too close to the curb, its engine a low murmur. JC stood on the gravel's edge, biting her lip, pretending not to notice how the passenger window inched downward. The man in the driver's seat had the practiced smile of a stranger who has decided not to be a stranger. The woman beside him leaned forward just as the car crept parallel to the child. "Hi there," the man said, his voice casual, a beat too bright. He asked for directions, something about a street name that did not exist, a question that was never meant to be answered. The woman's eyes flicked to the side mirror. The man's hand moved. The door swung. The world lurched. There was a sudden spray of gravel, a hand like a clamp on JC's wrist. The breath knocked from her chest as she stumbled and fell forward into the car. A stun tightened her limbs, and then a thudding, blank quiet, the smell of upholstery and cigarettes, and the sound of the door slamming like a verdict. The car rolled away, slow at first, then fast, the bus stop shrinking behind them, the road unspooling in a ruthless line. By late morning, sirens stitched across Tahoe's blue bowl of sky. Deputies fanned out through neighborhoods, neighbors stepped onto porches and shaded their eyes. JC's mother, Terry, was called at work and arrived with her heart already sprinting. A marathon of questions that had no ankles, no knees, nothing to stand on. The pink jacket was nowhere. The sidewalk held only an impression of small shoes. The day felt misprinted, like a calendar had been stamped wrong, and no one knew how to fix it. The car with JC in its back seat climbed out of the mountains and down through the Central Valley. Heat clung to the windows. The couple in the front were nearly silent, as if they were transporting glass. They were Philip Garrido and his wife, Nancy, names that would become a kind of echo in the years ahead. Hours later, the sedan turned into the dull hush of an Antioch cul-de-sac, then down a driveway toward a nondescript single-story house at the end of a street that seemed to forget it was supposed to end somewhere. Beyond the fence, hidden from the view of neighbors and passers-by, stretched a backyard no one really saw. Behind the main house, across a patchwork of weeds and broken concrete, behind a second rattling fence and another gate, there was a maze of sheds, tarps, tents, and a soundproofed outbuilding. It was a place of blind corners and jury-rigged doors, a place constructed to confuse the sky. Philip led JC across the crunchy grass and into the hidden yard, through a gate that complained on its hinges, under a tarp that breathed in the breeze, and finally into a room that swallowed sound. The door shut, the dim light blinked. He told her she would be safe if she did as she was told. He told her this was temporary. He told her things that sounded like comfort but felt like locks. The air was stale. She could hear her own breathing. In South Lake Tahoe, the search became a map of grief. Flyers multiplied on telephone poles. The photo of a blonde 11-year-old with clear eyes and a shy smile was taped into windows and pinned to corkboards in grocery stores from State Line to Placerville. Volunteers combed creek beds, abandoned lots, edges of trailheads, anywhere a mystery might choose to hide. The school bus driver was questioned again and again. The woman at the corner house replayed her morning coffee over and over, searching her memory for a detail that might turn into a door. Leads arrived thin and loud and then went quiet. The day rolled into the next. Summer burned into fall. The calendar turned its pages even when no one wanted it to. For JC, time reduced itself to a sequence of small survivals. The morning was a small survival. The noon hour was a small survival. The way the sunlight leaked through the seam of a tarp and crawled in a slow square across the plywood floor was a small survival. She learned the sounds of the yard the way a person learns a language. The swallow of the hot water heater, the rasp of a rake on gravel, the hollow knock of Philip's footsteps versus the lighter step of Nancy, whose presence was a weather that changed without warning. When Philip disappeared into the main house or ran errands in town, a different kind of air filled the room. JC counted and recounted the seconds between those footsteps, counted until counting felt like a promise. Philip talked to her as if she were both audience and captive wind. He talked about a God he believed was directing his every step, about voices he thought were guiding him. He paced, he jotted in notebooks. He played music to the empty backyard as if the air needed to hear it. He told her he had changed. He told her she would help him become good. There were days when he made vows to invisible witnesses, vows that crumbled with the dusk, vows that got replaced by locks and instructions and threats. There were nights when the sky stretched over the backyard and pooled blue-black on the tarps, and there was no sound at all except crickets and the far hush of traffic on a road she could not see. In the outside world, Terry refused to let her daughter's name become a past tense. She stood at vigils where candlelight trembled in paper cups. She answered calls from strangers who whispered hints they could not verify, callers who insisted they had seen a girl who looked like JC in a grocery store aisle 3 counties away. She met with detectives, learned their careful language, felt the slow arithmetic of a cold case tug at the edges of her resolve. On the anniversaries, she brought flowers, she spoke into microphones, she stared down the collected lenses of TV cameras, and begged anyone listening to keep the phone lines open, to keep their eyes open, to keep hope stubborn and loud. Back in the Antioch backyard, seasons turned. The hidden yard baked in summer, each tarp a heat trap, the sheds simmering with the afternoon. In winter, rain drummed and pooled, leaked along seams, dampened the blankets until they carried the smell of wet canvas and mildew. Years were learned by the ways the light shifted through new tiers in the tarps. The world beyond the fence evolved like a rumor. JC grew older. She passed the birthdays by tracing the old one in her mind, then the next, then the next. The old clothes no longer fit. Her voice adjusted to itself. She learned to keep part of herself folded away like a note no one else would read. When she was a young teenager, the backyard arrangement metastasized. There were more structures, more wires, more pathways that led nowhere. Philip built a tiny improvised world that operated by rules only he understood. A world that pretended to be order but smelled like fear. He spoke of redemption and then demanded obedience. He prayed out loud and then reset the locks. He promised daylight and then designed new shadows. In time, 2 small girls were born in that backyard. JC learned to mother inside a space that had no horizon, learned to make games from what she could reach, learned to read the sky like a clock because the calendar felt like a rumor. Their laughter sounded startling and wild, like birds that had found their way into a cavern and decided to sing anyway. There were neighbors, of course, in Antioch, as there almost always are. They noticed oddities the way people notice them, with curiosity that thins into shrugs when there is no clean answer. A gate that stayed locked even on easy afternoons. A man who talked to himself and to no one in particular, who sometimes played music too loud and then apologized with a smile that looked like a paper cut. Calls were made once, twice, the kind of calls that fall into a bureaucratic maze and come out the other side with a note. Life went on, mail was delivered, lawns were mowed and not mowed, people waved and then went inside. Years layered themselves one upon another until the backyard felt like a country where clocks were merely decorations. Yet, on a late August day in 2009, inside the leafy calm of the University of California's Berkeley campus, something finally tilted. Philip arrived with the 2 girls, now school age, leading them as if he were their guardian, which he was not, and yet in that moment, he played the part with a confidence that looked like certainty. He wanted a permit for an event that had the scrim of religious purpose. He spoke with an officer who listened longer than the man expected, and while listening, this officer noticed the girls' eyes and their insufficient answers, noticed how their words seemed borrowed, noticed the way Philip talked over truths that should have been simple. That thin thread of suspicion grew. The officer made a call, another campus officer leaned in. A parole agent, who had known Philip on paper and in scheduled visits, pulled those papers off the shelf and fanned them like a hand of suddenly dangerous cards. Someone asked Philip to come in. He returned to his hidden house, collected the women and the girls, and then drove back to the parole office as if the story he had told himself could stand up in the light. He believed in his invention. He believed in the labyrinth he had kept. He did not understand yet that the doors would open anyway. At the parole office, the light was sterile and equal, the kind that does not cave to performances. The conversations forked and turned. Names were offered and then corrected, then offered again. Simple questions were asked, and those simple questions made the room feel complicated. JC's heart was a runaway horse in that room. She had learned the art of caution to a degree most adults never have to consider, yet something in the air changed, something she could feel even as she clutched the hands of the 2 girls. A sympathetic voice coaxed, not a command, but a path. A detective stepped close, a woman with steady eyes and a tone built to be believed. Who are you? Not who he says you are. Not who you have been made to be. Who are you? JC had spent nearly 2 decades without her own name spoken to her in a room that was safe. She had practiced her real name silently in the dark once, then stopped, because language could be dangerous in a place that weaponized attention. In the parole office, her voice went first to a whisper. Then it rose. My name is JC. The syllables felt both new and ancient in her mouth. The room inhaled. The parole agent stepped out into a short corridor and made a phone call that hit like a bell. Shortly afterward, the detective placed another call, this one to South Lake Tahoe. On the receiving end, a department that had carried a case for 18 years paused. The afternoon there was warm, the air thin and precise, and then the voice on the line said a name that had become, for many, a memorial. "We think we have her. We need you to come." By evening, the Antioch property was strung with tape and lantern light, the quiet of the cul-de-sac shattered by radios and the careful footfalls of law enforcement. The backyard, that stash of makeshift rooms and weathered tarps, was transformed into a scene that had to be read like a book whose chapters had been intentionally scrambled. Officers moved through the maze with slow purpose, measuring the distances between doors that had never opened to outsiders and noting the ways the structures intersected, which made no sense to anyone who valued daylight. Evidence technicians spoke in low voices, called out to each other with single words, logged what could be logged. They cataloged not just objects, but the architecture of control. In a separate room, JC sat with her daughters, the fluorescent light softening in the evening. She held their hands, answered their questions quietly, and tried to stitch together a way to explain a world that was finally beginning to expand. She tasted the idea of tomorrow and found it strange and too bright, but the strangeness did not scare her. It felt like a cliff with a rail and a view. When she was asked if there was someone she wanted to call, her breath faltered. A phone appeared. Numbers were dialed. The ring went through deep space, through years that suddenly felt stackable, and landed in a house where a mother had never moved out of the reach of hope. Terry picked up and said hello, a word she had said a million times, yet this time it trembled like a bell being struck. The voice on the other end was thin and winded, the voice of a person who had been walking a long time and had finally stopped. Mom. The room seemed to tilt. The sky outside her window seemed to listen. Then the rest of the sentence came, threaded with disbelief and something stronger than relief. It is me. There are reunions that are filmed and end up being watched by people who need proof that gravity is not the only law that holds. There are reunions that happen behind closed doors and remain private, quiet as a hand sliding across a table to find another hand. The reunion between JC and her mother was their own, edged by cameras and microphones, yes, but also protected by the choice to keep some sentences unrecorded. They met again on a late August evening, 2009, faces altered by the mileage of years, and yet instantly familiar, as if the day in 1991 had only just turned its head and been coaxed to look back. In the days that followed, leaks and headlines tumbled into the world at their usual velocity. The hidden yard in Antioch was shown from above, from the side, in crude sketches and careful diagrams. The arc of the story compressed itself into the speed of news. Seemingly, everyone had something to say, a version of events to rehearse, but beneath the public narrative ran the quieter work. There were interviews paced not by the clock, but by breath. There were counselors who understood how to measure time differently, by thresholds crossed and numbness thawed. There were legal proceedings for Philip and Nancy, whose names now carried the weight of charges and the silent noise of courtroom air. There were case numbers and dates and the kind of paperwork that is a civilization's attempt to name harm and place it in a ledger. For JC and her daughters, there were firsts tucked inside ordinary acts. The first time a door opened without a key kept elsewhere. The first time a window looked onto a street that she could step onto without permission. The first time the voice of a neighbor carried through the evening and sounded like a possibility instead of a threat. Grocery store aisles were vast, blinking with options. The smell of laundry from a machine in another room felt like a story told by someone who loved her. Silence changed flavor, no longer sharpened by dread, now merely a space to fill or not fill. She learned again to wear her name comfortably, to let it ring and rest, to let it introduce her and not scare her. When the state's attorneys presented their case, they spoke for hours about years, and yet no speaking could be sufficient to balance what those years contained. The law did what it could, which is never all of what is needed, and the court offered outcomes that felt both necessary and insufficient by design, because the past cannot be erased, only contained and named and held at a distance by offensive consequences. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, choices began to stack in front of JC like bright stones on a path. Some days she chose quiet. Some days she chose loud. Some days she chose to remain still and let the sun find her where she Saturday. In her own time, she began to write. She found that language, when it is not being used to threaten or confuse, can become scaffolding. She wrote about mornings that made sense. She wrote about the night sounds she now loved. She wrote about the moment her name returned to her in a room that smelled like coffee and printer paper and relief. She wrote about love and how it had survived in a hidden place, stubborn as grass, finding the smallest crack in concrete and insisting on green. She wrote for herself first, then for her daughters, then for anyone who needed to know that the story did not end with a gate opening. The story continued into kitchens and parks and classrooms and quiet late nights in rooms where the walls were just walls and the doors were just doors. There is a photograph taken long after the late August day, when the world learned her name again. In it, the light is ordinary. The frame is sweet with nothingness. A table is set. A window shows a sliver of an afternoon that has not been arranged for television. There are no tarps, no shed doors, no hinges that stick. The weight in the photo lives not in what is seen, but in what is missing. The backyard that had swallowed 18 years does not exist here. There is only the open fact of a life going forward, even if forward sometimes means a small step and then a pause, a breath, and then another step. If you listen closely to how such stories end, you will hear that they often refuse to click shut like a latch. Recovery is not a straight hallway, but a series of rooms that open into other rooms. Still, there are endings that feel right because they are honest about what was taken and clear about what remains possible. In this story, the ending is not triumph shouted from a rooftop, nor is it a curtain falling on a stage built entirely of sorrow. It is a closing that understands the magnitude of a morning in South Lake Tahoe and the vast courage it took to speak a name out loud 18 years later in a small office near Berkeley. It is a closing that sees a mother and a daughter standing together in the kind of sunlight that does not ask for anything in return. So the last image is quiet. A front door stands open to a world that is, finally, simply a world. In the distance, an ordinary bus exhales and moves on. A name is spoken, once, clearly, just to feel its shape. Then the door is gently closed, not in fear, not to hide, but with the calm assurance of someone who knows that inside is safe and outside is just a day unfolding. The latch settles, the house breathes. And the story, held steady by the people who refused to forget and by the person who survived, comes to rest without fanfare, complete in its own measured way. She left a note saying, "Be right back," then she was gone. The paper scrap was half the size of a postcard, torn from the top of a spiral pad so that a thin fringe of white curls still clung to one edge. It sat beneath a ceramic magnet shaped like a gull on the refrigerator door of a rental cottage in Neskowin, Oregon. In ordinary light, it would have been nothing, the sort of domestic scribble that comes and goes in a kitchen. In the early evening light of late summer, the message seemed to hum with meaning. Be right back. The person who wrote the words was named Maren Aldridge. She was 30 years old that summer, a museum registrar from Spokane who had driven to the coast for a long weekend with two friends, a thrifted ice chest, and a stack of folded maps that she refused to throw away even though everyone else trusted their phones. The year was written across a wall calendar in whaletail silhouettes and block letters at the cottage. It said late August, the first week leading into a holiday weekend in the year 2019. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? The Friday they arrived, wind combed the beach into ripples and folded the froth back on itself. The cottage was salt-streaked, cedar-shingled, the kind of place that keeps the smell of the sea even when the windows are shut. You could hear the surf from the tiny porch. When the three friends, Maren and a pair of college companions named Tala and Greer, unloaded their bags, they joked the gull magnet would be their butler and declared the calendar their house rules. Maren tucked her maps between the microwave and a jar of wooden spoons. She slid a small field notebook into her pocket, the same one she brought on hikes, to list birds she never got around to identifying. She wore a windbreaker, the color of beach grass, and a cheap digital watch with a face scratched until it clouded. They cooked late that first night, steam purling the kitchen window while onions went soft in a skillet. Laughter threaded across the room. Music low. a local station with a disc jockey who loved to say the tide numbers out loud like scores at the end of a game. When the three finally fell quiet, the cottage ticked and settled around them. Outside, a buoy clanged through the darkness. On Saturday morning, fog slept on the dunes. Greer left early to run south along the waterline and came back rosy with cold, reporting a scatter of sand dollars and a blue heron standing as if forgotten by the rest of the shore. In the late morning, after coffee, after toast burned once, and the fire alarm chirped in protest, they drove inland to a farmer's market and a thrift store where Tala found a jacket old enough to be stylish again. Marin wandered the aisles with a small stack of postcards in her hand, reading the scrawled messages as if she might recognize a name. On one, someone had written, "The coast is a kind of cure." On another, "Tell Gwen the sea keeps secrets she does not need." She bought both and tucked them with the others. What no one there noticed, because there was nothing to notice, was that all the threads of an ordinary weekend had already aligned. The hours were arranged like stepping stones. Every detail was in its place. The note did not exist yet. In the late afternoon, clouds tore apart and left the sky a pale, rinsed blue. They ate early on the porch. A gull stared with criminal intent at their salmon. The air smelled of cedar and the metallic tang of the tide. Tala read a text from a coworker and complained good-naturedly about the office. Greer worried about wildfire smoke that might drift into the valleys later in the week. Marin chewed thoughtfully and said she wanted to walk, just a short loop up the bluff trail and down toward the beach grass, to see if the small creek behind the cottage still made that silver sheet where it fanned into the sand. She fished the field notebook from her pocket and stuck it back. She made a small show of taking nothing with her, no bag, no water, just the windbreaker and the watch and a hair tie she had to twist twice to hold. She took a pen, the one she liked, with a fine needle tip. "What time is it?" Tala asked. "A little after 6, Marin said, glancing at the scratched face. "The light will hold. The fog's a rumor tonight." She stepped inside long enough to write the words, "Be right back" on the torn scrap and slip it beneath the gull magnet. Then, amused at herself for the ceremony of it, she said aloud to the empty kitchen, "I will." She could hear her friends on the porch laughing at something she had not caught. She closed the door gently, as if it were a sleeping child. The last image the two friends had of her was at the corner where the cottage path met the lane, her back a soft line of beachgrass green, her hair a loose plait dark against the jacket. She raised her hand in a small wave without turning around, then walked out of sight. The trail climbed into shade, Sitka spruce stitched the slope together, and the path, packed down by hikers and dogs, was wide enough for two abreast. At that hour, the day hikers were already gone. The air thinned and cooled in the trees. Somewhere above, crows heckled a hawk and went quiet. When the trail flattened and the canopy opened, the sound of the ocean returned, a steady breath taken in and out. Marin paused and looked across the low water to the headland, then took the right fork toward the bluff. She was not a risk-taker. She was the friend who made safe choices and brought spare socks. If a sign suggested caution, she obeyed. Her field notebook had neat, patient lines. She did not scribble, she printed. At about 6:30, down on the porch, Tala stood to clear the plates. She noticed the gull magnet and the note and said, "She is cute," as if affection could be pinned there with the paper. Greer said, "We should open a bottle and keep some for her," and leaned into the kitchen to set the corkscrew on the counter. The air cooled a degree. Somewhere straight out at sea, the buoy answered the hour. By 7, the color had drained from the grass, and the first of the evening chill slid down from the trees. Tala texted, "You good?" Greer texted a small wave. Neither of them felt any tug of dread. The note was a promise, and they respected people who say what they will do. At 7:15, a dog walker climbing from the beach saw a woman in a green jacket standing behind the low fence that marked the bluff's edge, and wrote later that she looked not worried but concentrated, like someone counting distant flashes. The dog paused, nosed something rank, and the walker tugged him on. At 7:30, a couple in the parking pullout at the top of the trailhead remembered a woman stepping down from the bluff path and touching the rail once with her palm as if it were warm. The couple argued in low voices about whether the coastal road was open to the south. The woman in green passed them and went inland toward the trees, or so they said later. The timestamps of their own photographs that evening placed them there at about 7:28. The phone chronicled the alibi in silence. At 7:40, the tide rolled itself close. At 7:55, Tala's second text made a sound that was too loud for the room. It hung there. By 8:15, they were standing in the lane with their hands shoved into their sleeves, looking toward the trailhead, telling each other the light would carry just a little longer. They tried to laugh. They said together, "Be right back," and both of them shook their heads at the symmetry. At 8:20, Greer walked up to the trailhead and went 100 yards under the trees, then returned. "I cannot see my own shoes," she said. Tala said, "She knows these paths." Greer said, "Not at night." They did not yet believe that anything was wrong. They believed in dead batteries and lost service. They believed in the way a friend's voice makes everything ordinary again the moment it returns. At 8:50, they called the non-emergency number for Tillamook County and were told to give it time. Adults on vacation leave for walks. Adults change their minds. Adults do not have curfews. The man on the phone suggested they go to the neighbor to ask if anyone had seen her pass. "Do not panic," he said, and you could hear in his tone that he believed he was offering comfort. Leave the porch light on for her. Put a towel on the doorknob if she might come in wet so she does not drip the whole way down the hall. At 9:10, they were texting again, then calling, then standing in the lane, then sitting, then standing. The gull magnet held fast to its square of steel. The note did not move. Wind pressed it flat to the refrigerator like a hand. Sometime after 9:30, a deputy named Keegan Holt arrived in a truck that choo-chooed over the gravel and then coughed quiet. He had the kind of face that looked older when he was thinking. He listened to the story on the porch while his radio muttered to itself in clipped numbers. He walked them through the expected questions, the ones that come like beads on a string: any medication, any history of walking off or wanting to be alone, a recent fight, a recent fear. He asked to see the note. He looked at the gull magnet and the words and wrote in a small book of his own, printing with the same quiet patience Marin used when she labeled outgoing loans for the museum back home. When did you last see her? A little after 6. What was she wearing? Her windbreaker, the green one, jeans, shoes, not sandals. She is too careful for sandals on the bluff. She said she was going to look at the creek fan where it runs to the sand. Did she take a phone? She left it charging, Tala said, and the sound of that sentence cracked. Just once, like thin ice in a glass. The deputy made a call, then another. He went to the trailhead, stood with his light pointed down the path, and turned in a slow circle so the beam drew a pale ring on the trees. He broadcast a description. He asked a neighboring deputy to stop by the pullouts on the coastal road to flash a light over the rail where the bluff faced the sea. He opened the trunk for a flare kit and then closed it again without lighting anything. The radio said other deputies were on their way. The radio said to take care on the boardwalk near the marsh. The radio said the tide was still coming in for an hour. Just after 10, a volunteer with a search and rescue group pulled up, then 2 more. They unrolled a map on the hood of the truck and weighted the corners with flashlights. Greer said if she got turned around, she would not have gone far. Tala said she would follow water down. Keegan nodded, then asked gently whether Marin would ever leave on purpose. No warning, no forwarding address. The friend said no in a way that made the word a room. No, she does not do that. She is not someone who leaves the table without saying where she is going. The deputy wrote, then set his pen down. The wind picked up and worked the brown needles of the trees into a hiss like the beginning of rain. A rescue dog arrived with a handler and sat so neatly on the gravel beside the truck that Greer felt herself breathe for the first time in an hour. The dog's name stitched on his harness was Benson. The handler stroked his ear and spoke to him in the voice people reserve for children and conspiracies. Good work soon. A quiet job. Find our green jacket. After 11, the dog wandered the lane, then the trailhead, then the first switchback under the spruce. Benson snuffed at the fence post by the bluff and sneezed, then put his nose down again like a fisherman threading a line. He pulled toward the right fork and went up the bluff path, then circled back. He was undecided, or the wind had folded and unfolded the scent and laid it down twice. The handler signaled left, then right, then shrugged and let the dog choose. The beam of Keegan's light made coins on the wet leaves. The ocean scraped and breathed and scraped again. Around midnight, two more trucks idled with their lights low, and a slow ping went out to other searchers. Tala stood with her hands around a mug, so hot it made the bones in her fingers ache. Greer had the tight face of someone who has kept it together in front of strangers and will not let go yet. When Keegan asked again what Marin might have been thinking when she left the porch, Tala said, "She is the kind who writes letters she never sends, then tucks them between the pages of books," meaning she loved the idea of saying it right. Greer said, "She slows down when she sees a certain kind of sky. Will it help to know that?" Keegan wrote both things down not because they were likely to help, but because sometimes a sentence will be the one someone needs to read later. He knew from other nights that grief likes an archive. After 1 in the morning, Fog came back as if it had gone just to fetch something it forgot. The dog made a new decision and walked the length of the fence along the bluff, then paused where the path bent into a shallow, sandy depression, the kind of place winter runoff liked to scribble. The handler knelt, lifted the dog's chin, and asked him. Then, Benson nosed a smudge of something on the rail. Keegan lifted his light and saw that a palm had touched there. Not a fall, not a slip, just a pause and a thought. He turned the light on the sand and found a lattice of small, delicate edges that might have been a shoe sole. They were not distinct enough to be forged into certainty. The sand rearranges its truths quickly. At 2, the tide turned and began to go out, exposing creek rock slick as pewter. The searchers followed the boardwalk near the marsh. They found nothing. They followed the creek down, where it lay itself into the sand and spread thin like tinfoil. They found nothing. Keegan radioed the Coast Guard station farther up the road and asked for a slow light sweep along the dark line of water. A boat's engine answered the sea with a low, steady punctuation. It placed a shape beside the noise and moved it, north to south, then back again. The note inside the cottage did not move. "Be right back" lay as it had been written, uncomplicated in its promise. Dawn came like a breath the house had been holding. The fog thinned. Birds threaded the trees with small, practical sounds. Tala texted Marin again, even though the phone sat charging 3 feet from her hand. The message went nowhere and said everything. Keegan gave them both a ride to the small station farther up the highway. The room smelled like coffee and paper towels. A woman at the counter offered a kind of silence that took effort to keep. "We will begin again," she said, "in a few hours. Fresh eyes, more feet." This happens, and sometimes the story ends with a door opening. Her voice was not false. It contained the memory of nights when the story had done exactly that. By late morning, flyers were printing in their thin gray lines. A reporter from a local paper stood just outside the station door with a notepad. He wrote cautiously, as if the act itself could be loud. He asked Tala what the note said. Tala said the words without looking down. He asked Greer for a photograph, and she scrolled her phone and found one from the market the previous afternoon, Marin holding a bouquet of dahlias that made the day look more vivid than it had been. The reporter thanked them and then went back to his car to write something that would be read by strangers over their morning coffee. He decided not to print the note's exact words because it felt like pressing too close to a window. In the afternoon, 2 women in rain jackets paused at the station door. They had been on the bluff the previous evening, they said. They had seen a woman whose jacket matched the description, but from a distance, and they could not be certain. They said she moved with purpose. They said she paused to look at the water as if reading it. They were sorry that they could not bring more. Keegan thanked them and wrote down the time they gave and the angle of the sun as they remembered it, which was useless and also not useless. That evening, as the light turned the undersides of the clouds to tarnish, the search widened. An inland team checked the logging roads. Another walked the beach north and south until their calves trembled at every dune. Someone found a hair tie the color of coffee near the base of a driftwood tangle and put it in an evidence bag with a label so fine it looked like stitching. Tala said it was the kind Marin bought in a jar, 22 a jar, and that she had 4 identical ones stuck on a doorknob at home. The deputy nodded and did not call it a clue. He let it be what it was, a small object that had belonged to a person and now belonged to the world. On Sunday, the first rumor arrived. A woman in a grocery store 10 miles inland said she recognized Marin and thought she bought trail mix and a map. The checkout clerk said no one bought paper maps anymore, not on a Sunday when the sun had come out after hiding. A man at a gas station glanced at the flyer and said he saw a woman in a green jacket get into a gray sedan. He said this without a time attached, and he said it with the obvious desire to be helpful, and that made the details softer around the edges. The deputy wrote it down and moved on to the next thing, which was a split rail near the end of the bluff fence where one nail had backed itself halfway out. He pressed the wood and it gave a little. He pushed it back and it held. On Monday morning, when the tide was low enough to show the scar of the creek clearly, a pair of searchers waded in neoprene at the place where fresh water met salt. They walked slow, they walked together. They found nothing that had not been on the beach the day before. The buoy out at sea counted the hours, the gull magnet in the kitchen held steady. It was the most faithful witness the cottage had. Investigations widen like circles made by a thrown stone, and then they harden into lines. People are interviewed, workplaces checked, phone records examined, cameras along the coastal highway reviewed for slices of green jacket walking past a window of convenience store light. It is tedious work and holy work. On Tuesday, at her museum in Spokane, a supervisor named Anna printed a letter for anyone who asked. It said that Marin had not been in any kind of trouble, that she had asked for those days off months before, that she had signed the art shipping manifest for a temporary exhibit on the Thursday morning before she left for the coast, and she had done so in her quiet, neat print, each letter in her name set down as if it mattered. On Wednesday, a ranger who knew the bluff by seasons rather than days noted that a section of the path near the fence had been chafed by more footprints than usual and that the roots there made a shallow shelf like a step. It was the kind of place a person might pause to look for whales. It was the kind of place a person might shift their weight and then decide to step back. He told Keegan what he had noticed. Keegan thanked him and wrote the words. In the evening, rain came thin as thread. Not enough to soak, just enough to smudge edges. On Thursday, a volunteer walking south toward Proposal Rock found a small pen with a needle tip and brought it to the station in a plastic bag. The pen did not have a name on it. It was the kind Marin used because it made her print narrow and sharp. Tala held it and then handed it back. She said it could be anyone's, and for a moment, it seemed a kindness to let the world be full of identical pens. A week later, the flyers were taped and retaped, their corners curly as the fringe on the torn scrap in the kitchen. A woman from a larger newspaper called the station and asked to speak with Keegan. He answered and said only what he could say, which was that they were still looking, still interviewing, still asking for anyone who had been on the bluff the evening of the walk to call. The reporter asked about the note. He said simply that it existed. The reporter asked if they believed she had left of her own choosing. He said the line that officers learn to say and mean. We are considering all possibilities. He meant, we are not closing any doors until a door closes itself. The door closed 2 weeks after the note. A fisherman working north of the headland saw color in the rack line that did not belong. He marked the spot by sight and kept his boat steady and did not look away. He called the Coast Guard. He told them he was sorry to tell them what he had seen, and they told him he had done exactly the right thing. A small procession of people who know how to be brave without an audience began moving toward a place they had all guessed and hoped at once. Later, when asked, Keegan would say the call came just after sunrise, when the day was pale and undecided. What can be said without taking more than belongs to the people who loved her is that Marin was found between the bluff and the rock in a narrow band of water that forgets then remembers every hour of every day. The ocean had carried her and then let her go. There were no marks of violence on her body. There were no signs that sent the narrative running down darker corridors. The medical examiner, in the manner of medical examiners, wrote what the water knows in a language of measured certainty. An accidental drowning, the document said. The words were not poetry, and they did not try to be. It is likely, based on the position and the time and what the ranger knew about the shallow shelf near the fence, that Marin stood where the view is best, where the headland swings out and the ocean widens. It is likely she set her hand on the rail as she had been seen to do. It is likely the sand gave a little, or her shoe shifted on a root, or she stepped down toward the edge to see better, and the bluff's face tilted her weight in a way she did not expect. It is not certain. The ocean swallows certainty and then speaks in hushing sounds that make you think for a moment that you hear an answer. You do not. You hear only the body's most ancient lullaby. Breathe, break, breathe again. Tala and Greer were brought to the station and told with care. The deputy chose words that could be held without cutting the hands that held them. He did not say lost, he did not say gone, he said found. He said her name and let it be the anchor of the sentence. He asked if there was someone he could call. They were two people at the center of a map that had folded too many times. Tala cried in a way that made no sound. Greer stood, then sat, then stood again. The officers knew what to do. They gave them a room and a pitcher of water and 2 paper cups, as if there were a ritual to draw a human being back into the world of objects. Later that afternoon, Keegan drove down to the cottage to close it carefully. The gull magnet still held the scrap. The words on the note did not look guilty, they did not seem untrue. The promise embedded in them had not been a lie, it had been an intention. He stood in the kitchen longer than he meant to. He took the magnet off and placed it on the counter. He slid the paper into a plastic sleeve with the quiet exactness of a librarian. He did it because he believed, perhaps superstitiously, that the things people leave behind deserve a witness. He moved through the rest of the rooms, gathering what should be gathered, opening a window to let the house change air. When he stepped back onto the porch, the buoy answered the hour as if nothing had happened at all, as if hours are things that can simply be counted and not felt. The next day, beyond the formalities and the transport and the signatures that punctuate a grief like staples through paper, Keegan drove to the bluff a final time. He walked to the fence and looked down without leaning. He could see the groove where winter water wrote itself into the sand. He could see the creek's fan lift a thin light as the sun slid free of a cloud. He closed his eyes and listened to the rush and pause. He said a few words to no one in particular and was not embarrassed by the fact of it. Then he drove back to the station to write his last note in a case that had never been a case in the way the word is used on television. He printed it neatly. Family notified, identification confirmed, cause of death ruled accidental, personal effects cataloged, note collected from residents. Weeks later, Tala put the small field notebook in a drawer without reading the pages she had not written. Greer folded the thrifted market postcards into an envelope and addressed it to Marin's mother in Spokane without adding a letter, because anything she wrote would be both too much and not enough. At the museum, Anna took down the staff calendar and smoothed it with a flat palm and turned it to the next month while her throat did a small private work of grief. The coastal paper printed a second story that was shorter than the first. It did not quote the note, it did not need to. The readers knew by then the shape of the promise and how it had unraveled. At the cottage, after the rental company sent a cleaning team that moved through with the reverence of nurses at dawn, new guests arrived. They noted the smell of the sea and the sound of the buoy and the way the porch board sighed when you stepped in the center. They admired the gull magnet, which the cleaner had returned to its place on the refrigerator as if it had always lived there and always would. They went to the bluff near sunset and leaned their elbows on the fence and looked out. One of them set a palm on the rail in the exact place where 2 weeks earlier a different palm had rested. The ocean reached for the shore and fell away and reached again. The creek wrote and erased its silver line. A dog barked, then gave up and lay down. The guests did not know the weight that had once collected in that small depression in the sand where runoff liked to scribble. They did not know that a deputy had stood there in the dark and made a private promise to carry a sentence carefully. In time, the story settled into the place where stories go when they are too ordinary for legend and too tender for gossip. It did not become a cautionary tale, not exactly. People still went to the bluff at dusk. They still leaned on the rail. They still set notes beneath magnets in kitchens and wrote words that said what they meant in the minute they wrote them. Be right back. Home soon. Just out. They meant it each time. Most of them kept the promise easily because life is generous far more often than it is not. What remains is a short sentence printed in neat hand, torn from a small pad, pinned under a ceramic gull. What remains is the sound of a buoy counting the hours like someone reading a list of names. What remains is a set of careful hands, a green jacket, a field notebook with a few blank pages at the end, and a stretch of coast that does not remember and does not forget. On a certain kind of evening, the light goes thin, and the ocean turns the color of old coins, and the fence makes a shadow that looks like writing. If you are there, and you lean your hand where she leaned hers, the rail will feel cool and unimportant. You will look out and think of everything you meant to do and say. You will understand, for a brief, exact moment, how a promise can be true and still not be kept. Then the hour will pass. The buoy will answer. The creek will spread its silver fan and fold it back again, and the note, snug under its small ceramic bird, will rest in its sleeve in a box in a room where the lights are soft and the labels are narrow and sure, held quietly for the people who need to know that the sentence existed, that it was written in good faith, and that it was not enough to overcome a step, a slip, the tilt of a bluff, the ordinary power of water, and the thin, unarguable law of gravity. There is no lesson the sea would admit. There is only the tide, an unhurried metronome. There is only a name spoken inside a room where the doors are shut and the windows are latched, and someone has turned off the overhead light. There is the sound of paper, thin and definite, sliding into its folder. There is the quiet the cottage keeps after everyone is gone and the porch boards breathe in the cooled air. There is the magnet, the gull, the square of steel. There is the sentence, faithful to its last. Be right back. She thought the house was haunted. A man was living in the Wallses. It started with the smallest sounds that could be mistaken for wind. A brush against old plaster, a hush of movement above a ceiling. The house on North Sheridan Avenue in Tacoma had survived more winters than anyone on the block, and it spoke the way old houses do, with sighs in the joists and uneven breath in the vents. That is what Maren Wycliffe told herself each night when the noises returned just as the streetlights blinked on and the gulls from Commencement Bay wheeled toward darker water. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? On a Thursday in late October of 2019, Maren arrived home from the public library just after sunset. Her hands were cold around the metal key. She had been cataloging donated paperbacks all day and wanted nothing more than a hot bath and a quiet hour with a biography she had set aside. The porch light stuttered, on and off, as if welcoming her with a nervous tick. She laughed softly, a single note that sounded like pretend courage, and stepped inside. From the entryway, she could smell damp wood and cedar. The house had belonged to a widowed teacher before Maren, a woman who kept bees and hung dried lavender bunches from the rafters. Maren liked the history of it, the way a home holds on to the people who cared enough to repair it. In the dining room, a framed photograph of Tacoma's old streetcars leaned against a wall that needed patching. In the small kitchen, a square window looked toward an alley where ivy climbed over a fence and kids scrawled bright initials under the utility meters. That night, the noise came again, but crisper. Tap, tap, a scrape. Then silence so complete she could hear the heat switch on in the basement. She set her grocery bag down and stood very still. Her breath found a fast rhythm that made her chest feel too small. She swallowed and called out in a voice that aimed for practical and landed somewhere near shaky. Hello. If someone is here, please answer. I am calling the police. Every cupboard was closed. Every door was locked. A curtain in the hallway stirred, though no window was open. Tap, tap. Then a dragging sound that seemed to move from the far bedroom toward the bathroom, where the clawfoot tub curved like a pale animal asleep. Maren's heartbeat rose and then steadied with a decision. She pulled out her phone and dialed her neighbor across the street, Madame O'Rourke, who preferred the French honorific because she said it made the mailman stand taller when he walked her steps. A retired piano teacher with sharp eyes and a softer smile, she answered on the first ring. Come stand on your porch, Maren said, trying to keep her voice level. Just for a minute, and listen. Within moments, Madame O'Rourke stood bundled in a thick cardigan, her posture precise even in slippers. From the porch, she tilted her head. The street was otherwise quiet, save for a bus a few blocks south groaning up a hill. Maren waited. Nothing. It is an old house, dear, Madame O'Rourke said after a long moment. They creak and clack when the air changes. Do you want Earl to come check the basement later? Earl was her son, who sometimes mowed lawns and sometimes disappeared for weeks fishing on a friend's boat. Marin thanked her, said she would be fine, and went back inside with a heart that would not agree to calm. In the bathroom, she touched the glass of the medicine cabinet. A thin fog from the earlier shower blurred her reflection at the edges. She wiped it away, and out of habit, she adjusted the small latch that kept the mirror shut. The next morning, the latch was open. Marin stood very still and felt a small but ferocious chill start at the base of her neck and fan outward. She had closed it. She remembered the click. She remembered the surety of that tiny sound. She tested it again, and it held fast. She turned her head and listened. The house offered a distant sigh, as if in apology. Over the following week, more minor wrongness drifted into place. A jar of coins turned so the label faced the wall, a kitchen chair pulled half an inch from the table, a speckled mug moved from its hook to the counter, handle angled just so, as if someone had set it down thoughtfully and left for a reason not explained. Each time, Marin searched for proof of her own carelessness, a moment when she had been distracted and left something where it did not belong. Each time, her memory insisted she was not mistaken. The noises were worst just before dawn. She would wake to the quiet thrill of adrenaline and hold her breath until her lungs protested, and in that held breath, there would be the faintest whisper of movement behind the walls. On a wet Monday in early November of the same year, she brought home a new lock for the back door, one with a heavier bolt. She called a handyman named Llewellyn Pardee, a quiet man with a hummingbird tattoo that looked ready to dart off his wrist. He arrived smelling of rain and pine soap. He replaced the lock and checked the basement windows, crouching to inspect the small latches that most people ignored. He tested each one and announced that they were sound. He climbed the narrow stairwell and looked at the attic hatch. He tugged the string and peered up into shadow and dust. "No footprints in the dust," he said, "and no signs the hatch has been moved in a while." He glanced at Marin, kindly puzzled. "You say you hear it mostly overnight." "Mostly," she said. "And sometimes when I get home, like someone is listening for me." His eyebrows pulled together, a small corrugation of concern. Mice could do small mischief, but not pull out a chair. Maybe there is a vent opening in a strange place, causing pressure when the air changes. "I can take a look at the ductwork next week." After he left, the house felt heavier, as if it had exhaled and decided to wait. Marin made tea and carried it to the front room, where a green velvet chair kept vigil by the window. She sat and watched the street, cars sliding past with headlights smeared by drizzle. A woman in a red raincoat walked a beagle that stopped to sniff every microsecond of the world, as if the day's truth lived in damp leaves. Marin pressed her palms to the warm mug and tried to imagine what a rational person would do next. She decided to write it all down. Date, time, detail. She started a notebook and kept it by the fridge. Tuesday, just after 11 at night, hallway creak, 3 steps, then a soft thud. Wednesday, 5:15 in the morning, kitchen drawer open, spoon out, placed on counter. Thursday, just before 8 in the evening, a draft in the bathroom, mirror latch loose again. By the second week of November, she was waking with an ache in her jaw from clenching. Friends at the library noticed her quiet mood. Her coworker, a reference assistant named Etta Holcomb, asked if she wanted to house sit her sister's condo while they were away for the holiday. Marin considered it, then shook her head, slow and firm. Leaving would not answer the question of what was happening inside her own house. It would only stretch the fear across a different set of days and walls. On a wind-colder Friday, the answer began to show itself in a way so clumsy that it felt like a dare. Marin came home and found a single page torn from a magazine tucked under the living room rug. It was a recipe, the edges ragged from hurried hands, and it had been folded into quarters and pressed flat, as if someone had used their full weight to hide it quickly. The recipe was for cider brine chicken. A rectangle of tape clung to one side with lint and grit stuck to its edge. Her mouth dried as she stared. The room's corners seemed to lean toward her, a narrowing. The rug had not been moved since she first put it down in early autumn. She lifted the rug and looked for more, her hands shaking. Dust and a penny. Nothing else. She took the page to her neighbor. Madame O'Rourke pressed her lips together and made a small, dismayed sound. Maybe a draft lifted it from a stack and it floated right there, dear. Under the rug, Marin said. Tucked, then taped. I do not keep magazines like this. And I do not have tape in the living room. Madame O'Rourke's expression changed, the sturdy lines of her face tightening with alertness. Come back to my porch for a bit, she said. Let us think. She poured Marin tea that smelled of orange and clove and brought out a dish of shortbread, placing it on a crocheted mat with small daisies. The porch had seen 100 piano students come and go, had held grandparents and late-night phone calls, and a small dog named Reggie who barked only at delivery people. It felt like a place where the walls kept confidence without being complicit. You will call the police, Madame said gently. Not because you are certain, because you are frightened. That is reason enough. The officer who arrived a half hour later was named Thaddeus Rook. He was patient and soft-spoken, a man whose posture said he knew the harm that certainty can do when it is wrong. He walked through the house, his pen ready but not eager. He inspected the doors. He glanced at the open spoon drawer, at the notebook by the fridge with its careful notes, then at the single magazine page sealed in a plastic sandwich bag Marin found under the sink. Has anyone else had a key, Miss Wycliffe? Only the realtor, long ago. And the handyman this week, but he was with me the whole time. A friend once watched the place when I first moved in, but she returned the key. I have not given one to anyone else. Thaddeus nodded and wrote in neat print. He crouched by the baseboards and looked for pry marks. He stood at the bathroom and touched the mirror frame, barely moving it, his eyes narrowing in thought. He turned and studied the wall to the right of the tub, where a section of sheetrock, discolored by age, met an older seam. The previous owner did some work back here, he said. See the line. That is newer. Have you ever opened the hollow behind the tub? Many houses this age have a plumbing chase, a space between walls that sometimes runs the entire length of a house. Often they lead to crawl spaces. Sometimes they can be accessed from the basement, sometimes from the attic. Marin felt her stomach tilt. I have not. He followed the wall back into the hallway and measured with his stride, counting off the distance from the bathroom to the far bedroom closet. He opened the closet and leaned his shoulder into the back panel. It gave a fraction of an inch, then held. May I, he said, gesturing to his multi-tool. She nodded, a frightening relief swimming up so quickly her eyes prickled. He cut a clean rectangle along a seam that looked more decorative than structural. When the panel fell forward, dust fanned out and a smell rose up, a mix of cold and old laundry and unwashed skin. Marin's throat clenched against a gag. Thaddeus switched on his flashlight and aimed it into the dark. The beam caught the outline of a narrow space just wide enough for a person to slide through sideways, the vertical ribs of two walls framing a hidden corridor that ran behind the rooms like a secret vein. He angled the beam downward. The floor inside the corridor showed smudges where footsteps had polished dust into an uneven shine. Finger marks scalloped the edges of the opening, the black crescents of grime worked into grooves, shallow shelves had been carved crudely between studs. On them sat 2 empty water bottles, a single glove, and a small radio without batteries. A half-eaten protein bar lay unwrapped on a rag that might have once been a t-shirt. Marin heard a sound come out of her that she had never made before, a breath that turned into a low moan and then continued, as if she had bent some internal instrument and could not make it stop. Thaddeus glanced back at her and lifted a hand that seemed to settle the air. Let us step outside for a second, he said. He radioed for another unit in a voice as calm as the quiet before a snow. On the porch, the late afternoon had turned the color of pewter. Rain began as a mist that made everything slightly more real. Thaddeus positioned her near the banister and asked gentle questions. Whether there had been thefts in the house or only disturbances, whether she had noticed food missing, whether she had seen anyone lingering in the alley. She thought of the protein bar and realized that, yes, a few cans had disappeared from the pantry. A jar of peanuts had felt lighter. Bread gone faster than she could account for. Minus 1 spoon. Minus a washcloth. Minus a sense of belonging in the place she owned. A second patrol car arrived. Officer Inez Paramo, compact and quick-eyed, joined them. Together, the 2 officers re-entered the house. Marin hovered at the threshold and then followed a few steps behind because not knowing had become unbearable. The hallway seemed longer now, the floorboards pulled tight with tension, the closet yawned open with its square mouth, the cut panel leaned against the bed like a warning shield. The flashlight beam slid along the corridor and paused on something printed on the wall. A line of calendar pages had been taped up in a column, days crossed out with careful slashes. The months were not current, they were stolen from old mailers, public flyers, a hardware store giveaway. The slashes formed a rhythm, steady until they broke into a stutter across the week of Thanksgiving. Next to one date in that week, someone had written a single word in pencil: cold. Inez whispered that someone had been living there a while. Thaddeus nodded once. They pressed forward, moving slowly, announcing themselves in clear voices that tilted toward kindness because kindness can keep people from doing desperate things when they are cornered. Tacoma Police. Come out slowly. We are here to help. Do not make any sudden moves. You will not be harmed. Silence. Then a rustle. A scraping inch by inch against wood that sounded like a person trying to become part of shadow. The flashlight beam steadied. A face blinked into view between studs, eyes wide, cheeks gaunt under a scrim of beard. The man wore a black hoodie mottled with drywall dust, and he held one hand up, palm flat, the other hand tucked against his chest, as if protecting something small and breakable. His voice came out hoarse and thin. Do not blare the light right at me. Please, I will come out. Do not hurt me. Inez softened her tone another degree. We just want to make sure no one is hurt. Step this way, hands where we can see them. We will talk on the porch. The man squeezed through the opening like a folded map unfurling. He was taller than Marin expected, but bent by close quarters and cold. His shoes were duct-taped at the toes. He looked at the floor, not at her. When he finally lifted his face, his eyes flashed with something that was not defiance. Not quite shame either. Something complicated and wounded that made Marin's own anger hesitate. He said his name was Corin Albee. He did not offer a last fixed address. He said he had come in through a broken basement vent in early autumn when night began to smell sharper and the shelters were full by evening. He said he had chosen her house because of the alley's cover, because the weeds were high, because he thought it was empty after watching the windows for a few days when she had been away visiting a friend in Portland. I never meant to scare you, he said, voice cracking on scare. I tried not to touch things. Sometimes I messed up. I am sorry. The officers searched the corridor and found a nest made from thrifted blankets, a flat pillow, a small battery lantern with a cracked lens, a milk crate of scavenged items. In the crate was a paperback from the very library where Marin worked, stamped, withdrawn, a slim prayer book from a hospital chapel, 3 postcards bundled with a rubber band, a photo of a pale dog with a black ear. Did you ever stand over me while I slept? Marin asked before she knew she was going to speak. The question sounded as if someone else had asked it, using her chest as a drum. Corin flinched as if struck. No. No, I did not. If I heard you come home, I stayed very still. If I heard you move, I moved away. I am not proud. I did not want to be this person. But it got cold. Thaddeus listened and wrote. Inez remained near the opening, scanning the corridor for anything that might suggest harm, a knife, a stash of pills, a serious plan. They found none. They found instead a journal scribbled in with a pencil worn almost to its metal band. The first page held a simple count of days and meals. The second page contained a list of things to do when the house was empty. Look for leak. Patch draft near tub. Check for mice around pantry. Stop taking food, find work, move on. The handwriting was careful and oddly hopeful. Corin was given a blanket and a bottle of water. He shook uncontrollably. A shiver that seemed to come not just from the temperature, but from the sudden absence of hiding. He kept glancing toward the opening as if part of his mind remained there like a limb not yet aware it had been freed. Thaddeus explained the options in a voice that respected the fact that this was a house and also a crime. There would be trespassing charges and maybe burglary, though the missing items would matter to the charge. There would be resources, a shelter, a counselor, a court date. He explained that the decision to press charges would involve the city, not only the homeowner. He spoke as if measuring each sentence to make sure it sat right in the air. Inez called for transport. The air in the hallway warmed by degrees, as if the house itself were edging back to a balance it understood. In the days that followed, Marin learned more than she expected about the ways people slip through seams. Corin had once worked hanging drywall for a contractor who lost a bid, then another bid, then let his crew go with a shrug and a promise he never kept. Corin had a sister in Spokane who had moved twice in a year and left a forwarding address that forwarded to a mailbox that now belonged to someone else. He had no current ID. He had a softness for small dogs. He could fix copper pipe well enough to keep a sink from singing. She learned these facts slowly because people in uniforms asked questions and people in plain clothes came to the porch and asked if she wanted to give a statement. She gave one, careful and unadorned. She had heard sounds. She had found the hiding place. The officers discovered him. She had not been harmed, though harm had happened in a different way that did not leave marks. The handyman, Llewellyn, returned and sealed the corridor with screws whose heads he painted to match the trim. He adjusted the bathroom mirror so the latch settled with a snug finality. He added a grate to the basement vent that looked like an exclamation mark finally turned into a period. When he finished, he stood with her in the kitchen and poured coffee from a thermos he carried everywhere. The coffee tasted like one strong thing in a week of weak ones. "You did everything right," he said, "even the frightened part. Fear keeps people cautious. Caution keeps people alive." The neighborhood adjusted too. Madame O'Rourke started leaving her porch light on from dusk to dawn. Earl fixed the motion sensor over Marin's back steps. The woman with the beagle changed her route and passed by more often in the evening, waving with a smile that reached all the way to her eyebrows. Children stopped chalking their initials in the alley and began drawing circles that looked like eyes. Tacoma's rain drummed steady on roofs and gutters and gave the street a sound that was almost clarifying. One afternoon in December of the same year, Marin sat in the library's break room with Inez Paramo, who had stopped by to return a book of poetry she had borrowed months before during an outreach program. They shared a microwave burrito and a bowl of grapes. Inez, out of uniform, looked smaller, younger, and somehow more formidable. She listened as Marin tried to describe the way her house felt now. "It is my place again," Marin said. "But in the night, I sometimes hold my breath and wait for nothing. The waiting is louder than the nothing." Inez nodded in a way that said she believed in the physical reality of fear as much as the fact of drywall and screws. "The mind makes ladders and trapdoors," she said. "It thinks in architecture after it has been inside a house like that. It will quiet." In the following weeks, Corin was arraigned. A public defender named Orrin Vest met with him. The judge listened to the recommendation for a diversion program that included counseling, job placement assistance, and a requirement that he not return to North Sheridan Avenue. The prosecutor did not push for a heavy sentence and noted the absence of violence and the presence of obvious need. The court clerk read out dates that would later become folded papers in thin files. Everyone spoke in the careful tone people use when they know something fragile could be made worse by their own voices. Marin did not attend the hearing. She chose instead to stand in her kitchen at 9 in the morning and twist the mirror latch one more time, a ritual that had the texture of an incantation. She made toast. She watched light find the edge of the counter. She exhaled in a way that allowed her ribs to feel like part of the house and not at odds with it. Later that day, she went for a walk along Ruston Way, where the bay lifted its shoulders under gulls that shouted irreverent laughter into the wind. A barista at a stand near the water remembered her order and did not remark on the fact that she now tipped more generously, as if redistributing luck. That winter brought a sky as pale as porcelain most mornings. Marin developed a new habit. When she came home, she said hello to the house out loud in a voice not for anyone else. Not a prayer. Not a superstition. A statement. I am here. This is mine. You are safe with me, and I am safe with you. On a late Sunday in January of 2020, after the holiday lights had been taken down and the street wore its familiar dimness again, Marin received a letter from a shelter downtown. It was short. It thanked her for cooperating with outreach resources and for speaking with the advocate who called the week after the incident. It said that Corin had entered a program. It said he had asked that the shelter deliver a small envelope to her if she agreed. The advocate had asked, gently, whether she wanted it. She had agreed, and now the envelope sat on her dining room table. She washed her hands, she opened the flap, and slid out a single page folded twice. The handwriting was careful, like the list in the journal. The words were simple. I am sorry. I believe you were kind even when you were frightened. I did wrong. I will try to be better and to be someone you would not be afraid to meet on a street. Thank you for not making me into a ghost. Her throat closed around a feeling she had not named yet. Not forgiveness, not even relief. Something like permission to build a life again, not only a habit of vigilance. She folded the note and slipped it into a recipe book her grandmother had given her long ago, between the pages that described how to simmer broth slowly and how to taste before adding salt. She did not tell many people about the note. It felt like something that would be diminished by more air than it needed. Spring came, as it always does, even when it seems it will not. The maples along the sidewalk lit up with leaves, and the beagle's route expanded back to the park. Maren planted herbs in a window box over the kitchen sink and discovered the way new green smells like electricity. Llewellyn stopped by to show her how to check the attic fan. Madame O'Rourke began teaching a young neighbor scales on an old upright that had not been tuned since her last student left. The street acquired a different music. In the hush of some evenings, there were still noises. Of course there were. A house is a living system of materials, adjusting and forgiving, tightening and releasing, making small negotiations with time and weather. When the sounds came, Maren listened, and then she did what she had practiced. She breathed until the breath was not a task. She named what she heard. Foundation settling, heat moving, rain. She waited until the quiet returned. It usually did. On a deceptively warm afternoon in early May of that year, she found herself cleaning the closet where the panel had once opened into shadow. She had been avoiding it as if it were a cemetery of wood. She pulled everything out, boxes and coats and a pair of shoes that had never quite fit. The back of the closet, patched now and painted over, looked unremarkable. She ran her palm over the new seam. It was smooth, almost too smooth for a house that had lived this long. She pressed her hand there and imagined the corridor on the other side, empty, filled only with the quiet that wood holds like memory. She set a small object on the shelf above, a round stone she had carried in her pocket since the winter. It was not a symbol intended for anyone else. It was the sort of stone you pick up on a walk because it fits the space between thumb and forefinger just right, and because its weight says something trustworthy about gravity. It sat there and did not proclaim anything. It just was. The city moved on because cities must. News cycles folded their own pages and found new ones. But the block knew. The neighbors wove the story into the fabric of the place the way people do. A caution not spoken loudly, a memory held and then set down with care. Sometimes a new postal carrier would pause on the porch, greeted by Madame's formal hello and her instruction to stand taller. Sometimes a bus would breathe at the corner and let off someone who would look up at the row of houses and decide to keep walking. Sometimes the beagle would lift a paw, listening hard to some frequency humans cannot catch, and then he would sneeze and pull his human toward home. Corin did not return to North Sheridan Avenue. Maren did not see him again, though once in a store near the transit center, she noticed someone with a familiar stoop buying a pair of work gloves, and for a second, the world wavered around the edges like heat above pavement. The man turned and was not Corin. Her breath steadied. She bought a packet of screws and went home to tighten the hinge on a kitchen cabinet that had begun to squeak. The hinge quieted. The cabinet closed with a sound that felt honest. By summer, the house had developed a new rhythm that included less dread and more trivial pleasure. Light moved across the wood floors in long stripes. A friend visited and slept in the guest room without waking in the night. Maren read books on the porch and learned to identify the call of a particular crow that liked the fur at the corner. She cooked the cider brine chicken from the torn recipe, not because of the history of the page, but because she had always meant to try it. She brined it overnight in a bowl big enough to whisper ocean. She roasted it until the skin crackled. She ate it at the table alone and then shared leftovers with Madame 2 doors down. They agreed it tasted like something worth repeating. There were still nights when Marin would wake and the house would hesitate. She did not blame the house for this. She did not blame herself. She stood and walked the hallway, not as a guard, but as a person who belongs where she stands. In the bathroom, she touched the mirror latch and listened for the click. She watched her reflection. She looked less haunted than she had feared. She looked like someone who had been afraid and had not lost the ability to be ordinary. On a morning in late September of the following year, after a long walk by the water, she returned to find a letter without a return address. She opened it on the stoop. Inside was a sheet torn from a job intake form. A few lines had been filled out: name, date, position applied for at a warehouse off South Orchard Street. At the bottom, a small note: I have a place now, and a bed. No walls to hide in. Thank you for not turning me into a story that ends with a door slamming. She read it twice. She did not tell anyone. She slid the note into the same recipe book near the other one. She poured herself coffee and sat at the small table by the window and let the day cross its own threshold into being. Outside, the trolley of gulls scissored the sky. Someone down the block started a lawnmower. A bus breathed and then moved on. The house, in its ordinary way, gathered all these sounds and made them into a song that no one would dance to, but most people could live inside. He pretended to be a Rockefeller and got away with murder. The story begins not in the skyscrapers of New York or the white mansions of Boston, but in a small town in Bavaria, West Germany, during the early 1960s. In a quiet community, among rolling fields and narrow streets, a boy named Christian Karl Gerhardsreiter was born in February of 1961. His parents were ordinary people, living without wealth or privilege. Yet from his earliest years, Christian displayed an unusual hunger for reinvention. He was restless in the life he had been given and longed for something bigger, grander, something that would take him across the ocean and into the heart of America. By his late teenage years, Christian became fixated on the idea of leaving Germany behind. In 1978, at just 17 years old, he managed to secure a student visa and traveled to the United States. When he landed, he carried with him not just a suitcase, but also an ambition that would shape the rest of his life. He did not want to be Christian, the son of modest parents from Bavaria. He wanted to become someone else, someone important, someone with status. This was the beginning of a lifelong deception. Throughout the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, he wandered across different states. He enrolled briefly in community college classes, he stayed with host families, and he tried different names. At one point, he called himself Christopher Chichester, an English aristocrat with a hint of mystery. He introduced himself to wealthy families in San Marino, California, an affluent community northeast of Los Angeles, and quickly began to charm his way into their circles. His accent, his mannerisms, his fabricated tales of noble ancestry all made him appear eccentric, but in a way that appealed to certain people who were drawn to the exotic. He wore tailored jackets, spoke of film projects, and claimed to be descended from European royalty. It was all a performance, but one that was convincing enough for him to gain access to homes, dinner parties, and opportunities that would otherwise have been out of reach. It was in San Marino, during the early 1980s, that Christian crossed paths with a young couple named John and Linda Sohus. They lived in a modest home on Lorraine Road, not far from where Christian, calling himself Chichester, had taken up residence with a local family who had allowed him to rent their guest house. Neighbors thought he was peculiar, but not dangerous. He spoke of connections to Hollywood, of plans to travel, and of friends in high places. What they did not know was that behind his polite smile lay something far darker. In the winter of 1985, John and Linda suddenly vanished. They told friends they might be leaving for a job opportunity on the East Coast, perhaps even abroad. After that, no one saw them again. Christian, the supposed English nobleman living next door, gave vague answers when asked. He hinted they had been recruited for secret government work. He dismissed questions with a casual wave. Months passed, and then years with no clear answers. The Sohus family grieved, neighbors whispered, and suspicion lingered, but there was no proof, no bodies, no clear trail. Then, in the backyard of their San Marino home, construction workers later unearthed human remains. It was John Sohus. Linda's body was never found. The tenant, Christopher Chichester, soon disappeared as well. He slipped out of California, and with him vanished the truth. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Christian's deception only grew bolder. He cycled through names from Christopher Mountbatten to Christopher Crow, posing as a Wall Street broker in New York. He claimed to have insider ties to high finance, to television, to the upper reaches of society. But perhaps his most audacious transformation came when he began to call himself Clark Rockefeller. With that single choice, he attached himself to one of the most powerful names in American history. To those who met him, he was Clark, the eccentric but brilliant descendant of oil baron John D. Rockefeller. He told stories of family estates, of yachts, of old money traditions. He dressed in preppy fashion, walked small dogs through Manhattan, and avoided questions with a mix of arrogance and charm. People believed him, or at least enough of them did to let him pass. In the mid-1990s, in New York, he met a successful businesswoman named Sandra Boss. She was intelligent, a Harvard graduate, and a partner at a prestigious consulting firm. Yet even she was drawn in by Clark's charm and by the aura of old money that surrounded him. They married in 1995, and for years, she accepted his identity without question. Together, they lived in high society, attending galas and dinners, with Clark spinning elaborate tales of family connections. He isolated her, discouraged her from inviting his so-called relatives into their lives, and maintained strict control over their world. In 2001, they had a daughter, whom he adored in his own obsessive way. To outsiders, they looked like a wealthy, if somewhat unusual, couple. Behind the facade, Sandra was enduring manipulation, secrecy, and increasing unease. By 2007, the marriage collapsed. Sandra filed for divorce, and in the process, the carefully constructed mask of Clark Rockefeller began to slip. Investigators and lawyers tried to verify his family ties, his supposed wealth, his claimed lineage. Nothing checked out. There were no birth records, no legitimate Rockefeller relatives who recognized him, no evidence that he was who he claimed. Still, Clark clung to the identity, refusing to let go of the fiction that had carried him for decades. Then, in the summer of 2008, during a supervised visit with his daughter in Boston, he staged a shocking act. As the social worker looked away, Clark forced his daughter into a waiting car and disappeared. It was a desperate act of abduction, an attempt to keep control of the only family bond he had left. The FBI launched a nationwide search. For days, headlines blared with the story of the fake Rockefeller who had kidnapped his own child. Authorities traced him to Baltimore, Maryland, where he was living under yet another false name in a rented apartment. He was arrested, his daughter safely returned to her mother. At last, the web of lies began to unravel. As investigators dug deeper, the truth emerged. Clark Rockefeller was not a Rockefeller at all. He was Christian Karl Gerhardsreiter from Bavaria, a man who had spent 3 decades weaving false identities across America. His history of deception stretched